Tariq has been doing evaluations and pushing me to think about evaluations for a long time. He's been doing evaluations for a number of aid projects and has an expertise in evaluation. He's also from Chicago, like me. He's also got a degree from Columbia. So Tariq is a very good, well-known economist. So I was able to rope him in primarily because of my friendship with him, not because he's getting paid. So thank you, Tariq. We welcome your and applaud your effort to help PIDE develop an evaluation cell. I agree with Tariq, having learned from him, that evaluations are very important. One thing that we never do in government is evaluate anything that we do. We kind of leave it half-hearted. The Prime Minister has talked about a performance management plan, but that in itself contains no evaluation. So PIDE wants to do evaluations of almost all donor initiatives as well. Sorry, it slipped out of my tongue, but nevertheless, yes, we are evaluating donors too. But we're going to evaluate government initiatives as well. We're going to evaluate universities as well, because evaluation should become a part of our research effort. We spend too much time doing research that is of a platitudinous nature, following international journals. But now I think we need to get more real and begin to think about what we are doing wrong and where. And that's what the evaluation effort is all about. So we're going to inaugurate the evaluation center today through this conference. So regard that as an inauguration. We'll invite Planning Commission members to say something, just to inaugurate the cell. Madam, would you like to say something? Yeah, aap sir kuch. Jaleel, please.
Thank you very much, sir. I think it's a great occasion for us that, that we are thinking of evaluation and we are thinking of establishing a cell in this regard. I'm member implementation and monitoring at Planning Commission. And this is, let me admit that this is one of the weak areas of us that, we don't carry out evaluation that comprehensively. Though we only carry out evaluation as a kind of closure of projects where there is involved, some human resources involved on the operational sides. So those projects are taken more care of. But now we are starting, you see, as a policy, evaluation of main key projects. So I think we would like to interact with whoever, in PIDES. If I'll request them that they can get in touch with me, and I'll give them, wherever, even the donor-funded projects, we can identify projects in different sectors, whether it is infrastructure, social sector, or other aspects. So we can discuss those projects, and we can, assist also in this regard. So I think, sir, that's all what I would say at this, time. But I think as we get engaged, we will, provide full support in this regard. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Ji.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Shabnam Fraz, and I lead the social sector portfolio at the Planning Commission. I would like to thank PIDE, and I think it's a very, very important area which is going to be touched upon today. Regulation, despite devolution, is something which remained as a federal mandate. And talking of from the social sector perspective, regulation of the healthcare industry, regulation of the healthcare workforce, and also, when we look at DRAP is already, I just noticed it's part of the agenda that we'll be talking in here today. Again, the education, the private sector, regulating the healthcare service delivery which is being offered by the private sector. I think it's a very, very important area, and the evaluation is going to give us the evidence to help guide further reforms, and also help us as we implement those reforms that whether we are on track and what needs to be changing. A very, very, I think we have, it's a very timely initiative, and we look forward to benefiting from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ji. Thank you very much, Ji. As you can expect, of course, we will be totally engaged with you, because PIDE wants to and must engage with all Planning Commission as well as government officials. We do that on a regular basis. We want to deepen that relationship. But before I go to the papers, let me quickly ask Tariq to say a few words of evaluation.
Thank you. I just want to mention briefly where these papers stand in terms of the spirit and practice of evaluation. My association with these authors goes back a few months, maybe to May or June, at which point I conveyed whatever I know about evaluation for the sake of development effectiveness, which is basically guided by the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. There are very comprehensive rules and guidelines for this kind of evaluation that we do in the aid business. It seems that the researchers at PIDE decided to go forward in their own way, which is fine. So as far as the formalities of aid effectiveness or aid evaluation is concerned, I think we should put those aside as we look at these papers. One of the principles, probably main principle, there are about 11 or 12, of international aid effectiveness is impartiality and independence. And there are some very set guidelines for what it means for the evaluation function to be independent. For example, it cannot be reporting to those who are responsible for the design and implementation of projects. The budget has to be independent of the chief executive. Human resources have to be independent. The reports have to be independent and not messed with, and so on and so forth. But most of all, I think there is an unstated premise also. Independence starts, first of all, with independence of mind. And I think, without stealing thunder from the papers, this is something that comes across very nicely in all these papers. The researchers have used their independence of mind. And this itself is a tremendous step in the right direction. Secondly, what I find is, I don't know any of these sectors on which the papers have been written. So I've reviewed them and we'll discuss them strictly from my perspective as an evaluator. But what is pleasantly surprising is how much evidence each paper has presented on its subject. And this one doesn't find this kind of wealth of evidence in other places, and particularly when it comes to the regulatory authorities as well as the couple of ongoing initiatives of the present government. So these are some good strong points to build from. Having said that, we are not quite there when it comes to evaluation, and how fast and how effectively we progress depends on the authors and others, including the Vice Chancellor at PIDE. I have offered some additional time to engage with each of the researchers to share a couple of main thoughts. And after that, let's see how this proposed center or the new center of evaluation progresses. It is definitely one thing that I keep requesting colleagues is, this evaluation business is not the same as research. Yes, it uses a lot of the same research tools, but it has its own requirements also. And I think you all would be well served, and the country would be well served, and the planning division would be well served if more of you were to take up some of those international principles and guidelines for international credibility, not just as researchers, but also as evaluators. Many of the tools and methods are the same. But you know, every, how shall I put it, every niche in development or in any other field has its own language, has its own basic rules and formalities. So I'm available to continue with this engagement from time to time. And the rest is up to you. But even before we end, I would definitely like to commend all the researchers, congratulate Dr. Nadimul Haq and PIDE on this tremendous initiative. You know that we do not have, as he mentioned, serious evaluation in the country. And if we do, it's very selective. If you don't like something, you say, oh, let's get it evaluated. Another, famous slogan is, कि जी इसका तो इम्पैक्ट ही नहीं पता. भाई आपके किस प्रोग्राम का इम्पैक्ट पता है? यानी गवर्नमेंट हो या एनजीओ हो, जो भी ये बोल रहा है, आप अपनी इवैल्यूएशन कराएं, अपना इम्पैक्ट देखें, because you are the ones who are associated with a certain cause. So if you want to serve the cause better, whatever it is, you need to take stock of the outcomes you produce, the impact, the way you've affected the lives of the target group, people, etc. So with that, I don't want to delay the presentation of these very interesting papers, but look forward to listening to you today and continuing to engage with you in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tariq. This is an evolving process, so we are obviously going to have to learn a lot. But the important thing is to have the evaluation cell going, and the important thing is to begin to debate these evaluations and put ourselves, the people of Pakistan, into an evaluative mode. Unfortunately, when I hear the TV debates every day, they're totally uninformed, and the only thing we talk about is corruption. We don't talk about evaluating what we are doing. We just think that solving the corruption problem, getting some money back, fictional money, which doesn't exist, is going to solve the problem of Pakistan. Unfortunately, it is not. Our universities are a mess. Our schools are a mess. It's time we called it out, and it's time we did a detailed evaluation to find out why they are a mess. That's why this project is so important, and we will do it. But let's not go into the philosophy of it. We will go upon it into details as we go along. So let's move along. Fida, over to you.
Thank you, sir. When we are going to start our presentations, first of all, I would like, as you have heard to Dr. Tariq Hussain, but I would still like to introduce him to you people. All those who doesn't know him, Dr. Tariq Hussain has worked in the field of development for 40 years, contributing to grassroots initiatives, governance, poverty reduction, and development effectiveness. He has expertise in designing programs, evaluating results, and facilitating improvements in performance and results. He has been leading international evaluation assignments for 20 years. Dr. Hussain has worked in all provinces of Pakistan, two-thirds of the districts, and 20 other countries. He has worked with the Ford Foundation, Al-Khan Rural Support Program, and the USAID Pakistan Monitoring and Evaluation Program. His consulting experience extends to most of the donor sector in Pakistan and a large number of NGOs and international consulting firms. Dr. Hussain is the author of 25 international publications and more than 30 media articles on national issues. These include 2 national reports for World Summits, the Pakistan Country Report for the World Summit on Social Development 1995 prepared for the Planning Division, and a National Progression Report for the World Summit on Sustainable Development 2002 prepared for civil society, and also Pakistan's first progress report on the MDGs 2003, for which he worked with the Planning Division and various ministries. Dr. Hussain received his BA degree from Columbia University, New York, and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Sir, I would like to thank you from behalf of whole PIDE that you came here, and now the rundown of the conference will be in 3 parts. We have 7 presentations that will happen in 3 parts. Part 1, session 1, 2 presentations, session 2, 3 presentations, and session 3, 2 presentations. In the first session, we have market regulations, competition policy, and the role of Competition Commission of Pakistan, Dr. Karim Khan and Dr. Ahmad Fraz. Second will be regulating pharmaceutical industry and analysis of the drug regulatory authority of Pakistan by Shahid, Mehmood, and Dr. Rizwan. I would request Dr. Karim Khan to please start your presentation. Please do not exceed more than 15 minutes. After 10 minutes, you will see a yellow chart that says 5 minutes left, and after that, when your time will be up, you will see a red chart that says time is up. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all for being with us on this important occasion. Basically, I will talk on market regulations, competition policy, and the role of Competition Commission of Pakistan. It is co-authored with Dr. Fraz. Okay, so market regulations, in fact, are exercised to ensure efficiency, streamline standard setting, and provide protection to consumers. when it comes to market as a mechanism for the allocation of resources, then competition has a central stage for its functioning. Why? At allocation stage, competition is associated with higher investment. It encourages innovations and raises productivity in economies. Likewise, in consumption, competition ensures a variety of quality products and services to consumers at cheaper prices or at competitive prices. At aggregate level, competition is associated with higher levels of economic growth and lower levels of poverty and inequalities within societies. These aggregate results are recently ratified by a study from Mexico, which shows that increase in competition in two sectors, telecom sector and product sector, reduces the levels of poverty and inequality within Mexico. What is non-competitive behavior? Actually, it arises when the firms with market power are raising their prices, limiting their sales, or charging discriminatory prices on their own. There are a variety of reasons for such behavior, like low investment rate in the country, efficiencies associated with economies of scale or some sort of natural monopolies, firms crowding out of existing or potential competitors, increased acquisition activities or mergers, and finally, some sort of regulatory barriers. And competition policy is basically as a tool to reduce or control such behavior. I'm sorry, why it's not functioning? Third stage, third. Okay, so in this article, basically we have three objectives. Firstly, we want to provide some stylized facts about competition in Pakistan. Second, we want to highlight the purpose and structure of the Competition Commission of Pakistan. And finally, we want to see what Competition Commission of Pakistan has achieved so far. In general, markets in Pakistan is presumed that they are concentrated and controlled by lobbies, having strong ties with either government officials or politicians. And if you see, actually we have very little research on market in Pakistan, or in particular on competition. Most of the research is undertaken by donors in international agencies. For instance, according to Bertelsmann Stiftung's Transformation Index, which ranks countries in terms of market competition, competition policy, trade liberalization, and banking sector efficiency, along with other characteristics, it shows that Pakistan is ranked among the list of poorly functioning economies in terms of market organization and competition policy. Though in terms of banking sector efficiency and trade liberalizations, we are performing a little better, but actually still our ranking is less than those of the advanced countries and emerging economies. And this finding is further ratified by the Pakistan's ranking on Global Competition Report. For instance, we are ranked at 110 out of 141 countries, and the main things of concern are limited competition in the domestic market, trade barriers, poor capacity to innovate and skills, and protection to property rights, and in particular the number of procedures to start a business, etc. So these things are major concerns in ensuring competition in the domestic market. And most of the donors or international agencies cite a variety of reasons for this behavior. For instance, the local or the domestic competition is constrained by structural regulatory barriers, market dominance by powerful firms, or the lack of effective competition laws or competition policies. Likewise, international competition or foreign competition is constrained by trade barriers, which are still larger in Pakistan compared to the comparable countries or our regional peers. So, but irrespective of the causes, the consequences are very severe. For instance, 70% of the firms in Pakistan are classified as small. And if we compare Pakistan with other countries, we have only 8% of the Pakistani firms as large compared to 54% in Sri Lanka, 52% in Indonesia, and 47% in Thailand. And in addition, we have a huge fraction of the economy which is still undocumented, ranging from 30% to 60%, depending upon the definition which is implied by different studies in different authors. And moreover, we have a huge fraction of, huge footprint of state in the economy. For instance, in terms of state-owned enterprises, these SOEs are not only inefficient, but actually they are limiting competition in the domestic market. In particular, with the industries which are of export interest to our businesses. But still, actually, we have a hope of despair due to a recent ranking in the country in the cost of doing business, but still we need to do a lot in that respect. Competition Commission of Pakistan was basically established to restrict such behavior. In fact, it is an extension of the Monopoly Control Authority, which had been in existence since 1970. It has 4 objectives, or you can say it undertakes 4 functions. Firstly, it prohibits abuse of the dominant position in the market. Second, it is presumed to restrict certain types of anti-competitive agreements. Third, it is entitled to control deceptive marketing practices. And finally, it reviews mergers or acquisition activities in the economy. And undertaking these tasks, actually, it applies the approach of carrot and stick. As carrot, it provides adequacy and provide guidelines for voluntary compliance. And as a stick, the law has the potential to impose monetary punishment as well as imprisonment in case of non-compliance. But actually, the evidence is very rare in of the approach of stick. Section 3 of the Competition Ordinance is about the abuse of the dominant position, which include practices such as predatory pricing, tie-ins, boycotting or refusal to deal, etc. Actually, it is not about the share of the firm in the market. It is about the abuse of dominance. For instance, a firm might have a share of 90%, but still it may operate provided that it is not using its share as dominance. In contrast, a firm might have a share less than 40%, but still it can abuse its position in the market. So actually, the ordinance of the Competition Commission is strictly concerned with the abuse of dominance instead of the share of the firm in the market. Section 4 of the ordinance is about the prohibited agreements, which include practices that restrict free trading and competition between business entities in any way. Section 10 of the ordinance is about the deceptive marketing practices. It includes practices that could result in transaction or in exchange on the basis of inaccurate or inappropriate information. Likewise, Section 11 of the ordinance is about the mergers or acquisition activities between different entities. Now look at here. Given these facts, stylized facts, and the structure of the Competition Commission of Pakistan, Commission of Pakistan has issued 481 orders so far. 362 of the orders are about the approval of mergers, and 52 are about the deceptive marketing practices, and 19 are about the abuse of dominant positions, and 30 are about the prohibited agreements. We have chosen basically 81 of the orders as our sample, because about these 81 orders we have all the information. If we see the notices which is issued by the commission of the 81 orders, 44 are about the deceptive marketing practices, and the remaining are about not 44, actually it is 52, and 29 are about the prohibited agreements. And if you see the notices by the complainants, actually 39 of the complaints are lodged by companies against other companies. Likewise, 26 of the notices are issued by the commission on itself, and 6 of the notices are issued on the complaints of the associations like Pakistan Textile Mills Association or Pakistan Sugar Mills Association, etc. And if you see, the notices are sectors wise. The fast moving consumer goods is dominating the other sectors, followed by food sector and household products. Likewise, there are around 7 complaints which is in the education sector, and 5 are in the automobile sector, and similarly around 6 is about the media. And if you see the conclusion of the inquiries, so there are 2 stages. In the first stage, investigation, around 66 orders actually suggested further investigations, and 5 of the orders actually the accused were found non-guilty, and in only 1 case there was punishment. So look at the punishment rate. 81 out of 1 case is associated with punishment. And if you see in the second stage investigation, so then the punishment rate is increases to 50 out of 81 orders. And if you see the time taken by the investigation, majority of the orders or majority of the investigations are undertaken from 3 to 5 years. And if you see the fines, the total fines from the investigations is 2,143 million rupees, and most of the fines are ranging from 50,000 rupees to 10 million, which is very like peanuts for businesses, especially the violators of the competition rules. Now look at here. In this whole process, I find 3 things. First, when I talk to the members of the commissions or some employees of the commissions, actually they told me that there is too much intervention from the government. In particular, actually they showed me one order which was about the FWO and National Logistics Cells, and they suggested me we write this order to the government, but actually the government is not taking actions. And similar is the case with other state-owned enterprises. So the state footprint in the economy is one of the major hurdle in competition in Pakistan. Second, actually I asked why the fine is so low. They told me that actually our decisions are reversed by courts frequently. So the intervention by the court or actually on the sides of the companies is another major hurdle. And the third one, they told me the informality in the businesses. As I told you, that around 30% to 60% of our economy is informal. So, and if you see the results of the World Enterprise Survey, 52% of the firms in that survey complained that they are facing unfair competition from the informal sector. So informality is another constraint actually that is affecting the decisions of the Competition Commission of Pakistan. So in summary, let me state that actually we don't let the market functions as it should have been, and we know the consequences in the form of sugar crisis, wheat crisis, oil crisis, and so on. Second, regulations are not necessarily or cannot necessarily, or maybe in some instances they would not produce the results. The results, the reasons are obvious. Firstly, we have significant monitoring and enforcement cost. Likewise, there is a cost which is associated with rent seeking, red tapeism, and cronyism, etc. So regulations are not costless. Actually, there is huge cost associated with regulations. Third, actually we have very limited private sector, and of course these 3 reasons are responsible for the development, the lack of development of competitive private sector in Pakistan. And let me ask a question from you. Do we need a competition commission for pessimist individuals like me? I would say no. But actually, then a central question arises, then how to control private abuse of the market in terms of externalities, overpricing and hoardings. And yes, then actually, yes is for pessimist individuals. Now, look at here. If yes, then competition commission should have the authority to exercise the law. And instead of voluntary compliance or advocacy and capacity building, it should exercise the law as it is in the written form. It must act and enforce like a referee that aims to avoid match fixing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. Do we have anybody from CCP who has a particular question about it? I'll then move to Dr. Tariq Hussain.
I have to say that I've read all the papers. I'm not a specialist in each of these subjects. I'm not working as an editor. So I'd just like to bring up some of the key points I noticed before others get into question answering. One of the key points is that markets in Pakistan are poorly organized with negligible competitive practices prevailing in the marketplace. And then referring to domestic competition, the paper says, it is constrained by regulatory barriers to entry, market domination by a few firms, and lack of effective competition policies. For foreign competition, it says, the level of foreign competition is low due to trade barriers, which are still relatively high. Two important points about domestic and foreign competition. It then looks at the history of the CCP, and it conveys the impression, I could be mistaken, conveys the impression that the CCP and the law it administers are aligned with international best practices and current economic realities. This is an impression it conveys, or at least I get. And it highlights the 4 essential aspects of the Competition Act, which were also mentioned in the presentation. Prohibit the abuse of dominant position leading to anti-competitive practices. Prohibit agreements or practices that restrict free trading and competition. Prohibit deceptive marketing practices. I think this is especially for consumers. And supervise mergers and acquisitions. So 4 very important aspects of the law. And then the paper says that the CCP has struggled to restrain anti-market practices. And influential businessmen and companies flout competition laws, which significantly weakens the role of the CCP. And after this, the paper has some useful information which was highlighted here, and some recommendations. I think going forward, it would help if this very rich set of findings, could be translated into some very sharp conclusions based on the evidence. One of the common problems is that as we look at these papers and some other papers, we are not strictly presenting conclusions that are supported by the findings we have cited. And we are not giving recommendations that are supported by the conclusions. So this is one thing I pick up as an evaluator, that I keep repeating, this would improve the usefulness of the already very useful work that you have done. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any questions from the board?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Tariq Sahab, a couple of things that I noticed in the paper, and I think should come out in addition to stuff you mentioned. One thing I don't see the paper addressing is the Competition Commission itself. Yes, there is a statistic that 29 or some odd times the commission itself took a step. So let's talk a little bit about what is missing. One is the sectoral distribution. So of all these complaints, misrepresentation, yes, they have mentioned media and all that, but it'd be nice to have specific examples. For example, if you were to ask a layman like me, who's on the consumer side, I can tell you that the Competition Commission has been quite effective. You take the case of Walls and various ice creams, the labeling of milk, for example. We found that the Competition Commission actually took note, and it has prevented these people from labeling most of their products as containing milk. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the electricity sector, and I think Dr. Nadeem last night said something very nice in the Twitter space, that it's the job of these sector regulators to make markets, the job of the Competition Commission to actually enforce competition, right? So if that is true, then how come the CCP has not played a role, for example, in the breakup of the vertically integrated energy market? So, I mean, that's a question I have for the authors, and maybe a little bit more discussion around, they should have gone in by now and talked to all the ESCOs and looked at, and it's not NEPRA's role to do that. NEPRA set the market rules. If people are breaking it, I think the CCP should be also part of this discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Karim, would you like to add something?
That point is very important. But let me tell you, actually, they would require further research. If you want to sector, actually, about the milk products and dairy products, it is true. Actually, I told you that it is fast-moving consumer. It is coming in fast-moving consumer goods. But discourse और इस तरह की चीजों के लिए मतलब ये कि मेरे ख्याल में एक independent study की जरूरत होगी और that's quite in particular I would suggest I would try to do a special study on state-owned enterprises and of course ISCOs are in these वो में आ जाते हैं तो मेरे ख्याल में that would be really it is a very valid point. I would do that.
So, Dr. Ren, thank you for presenting a nice paper on competition. So, one thing you said that the courts often reverse the decisions. So, do we have any further information why the courts are the cases prepared by the Competition Commission wrongly adjudicated, or is there a lack of capacity or something? Secondly, if you can beef up the report with some cases like which apparently look like uncompetitive practices but have not been taken up by the Competition Commission, or the Competition Commission has taken up, let's say, 2 or 3 years to decide that there's something like this. This would add value to them. Thank you.
Okay. Good. About the first point, actually, this is a very valid point, and actually I forgot during it my presentation. Actually, it is the complexities in laws. And this is the society of developing countries. This is the problem of developing countries. We have complex laws. Why not to simplify laws? Actually, court जो है ना जहाँ court में केस चला जाता है तो वो law पे चला जाता है. तो law में इतनी complexities हो जाती है कि वहाँ पर कोई ना कोई point निकलता है. This is the main reason for the reversal of decisions. So let's simplify the laws. मेरे ख्याल में जो ना इसकी best answer ये है. पाकिस्तान में court की decisions इसी वजह से मतलब ये कि reverse हो जाते हैं कि the laws are complex. जो सेकंड पॉइंट है इसमें मतलब ये कि हमारे पास इस तरह की एग्जांपल्स तो नहीं है कि जो कंपटीशन कमीशन ने नहीं ली. इस तरह की एग्जांपल्स है कि जो कंपटीशन कमीशन ने ली हुई है लेकिन उसमें गवर्नमेंट ने एक्शन नहीं लिया. इस तरह 2014 में एक ऑर्डर इशू हुआ था एफडब्ल्यूओ के अगेंस्ट और सेल्स के अगेंस्ट, but actually the government didn't take the action. In some cases I think the competition commission जहां पर मतलब ये कि especially SOVs का केस है उसमें मतलब ये कि जहां तक punishment या enactment का ताल्लुक है वो मतलब ये कि उस लेवल तक नहीं जाती. I don't know why. Basically the law provides them the right to take action on itself, but in some cases actually they are not taking. I don't know why. This is a very this is my remark about your points.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. Dr. Hijazi has a question, and that will be last question for this presentation. Thank you.
Actually, I was trying to focus out on the paper, and I was trying to find out that, whenever we are talking about regulation, we have got a human being behind the behind the scene. And we have a big governance problem. And one of them is that there's a frequent transfers of people and not ownership of the system. Have you worked on that, or you have just skipped that?
Not specifically, but actually you're right in that sense that in fact all the commissions they actually nominate the members for 3 years and maybe the ownership problem arises. But actually I didn't work specifically on that.
One question is about the
यार माइक ले लें आगे आ जाए
basically the right to because their service are their product is subdued, particularly gives us some submission. So whether the parties allow new products are not any foundation it delivers or not. This is one question. The second question is about the basically the space we give to the government means the issue is the state-owned enterprises. Because in China we have the state-owned enterprises, we have also the private sector over there, but there is not a clear demarcation, but the state-owned enterprise normally work in the infrastructure sector because they provide basically the conducive environment or working on the infrastructure, but still there are private companies also. Since China is a big, huge market, and private sector also get a job. But in Pakistan, with a limited PSDB, with a limited development funding, I think if the state enterprises go into such things, I think the private sector doesn't have basically the sufficient space to play. Thank you.
Dr. Karim, there is another comment and then you can answer together.
just a small comment. Isn't part of the problem due to the fact that we don't know whether it's state-run businesses or is it private businesses? There's a lot of overlapping of the two. There's no clear demarcation. We don't have the thing followed by the, let's say, as demarcated or proposed by the School of Economics at Chicago and other places. So that's the problem. We don't have a clear demarcation between state and private sector. Okay.
Okay, so let me answer. Firstly, the facilitation perspective to the businesses for new innovations in this type of thing. Actually, Competition Commission, you have to lodge complaints. For new innovators, if their property rights are violated by someone, then you have to lodge the complaints. And of course, Competition Commission is taking actions on the complaints. And you saw in the results that majority of the complaints are lodged by companies against other companies. So there is, about this, facilitation is only limited to advocacy and voluntary compliance. The second point, SOEs, the problem with China, I guess is the SOE structure in China and the SOE structure in Pakistan are completely different things. And maybe the problem is not ownership, but the problem is something else in the governance system, I guess. For Pakistan, the problem is in SOEs, the most important strategies for SOEs are not marketing purposes. Actually, SOEs has turned into Pakistan as a job provider instead of marketing structure. I would really suggest the Competition Commission to take to do specific study on the ownership structure of the SOEs. Then the demarcation issue would also be resolved in one way, and the other issue it would provide a level playing field to the private sector in the presence of SOEs in that particular sector.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. We'll move to the next presentation now. That's Regulating the Pharmaceutical Industry, an analysis of the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, DRAP, by Mr. Shahid. Over to you, Mr. Shahid. After.
Thank you, Mr. Rahman. So this presentation is about the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan. Now, it's an important one for the simple reason that most of the times that drugs or medicines are in the news, that's basically for the reason related to prices, especially price increases. and there is a lot of hue and cry over that. But it's more than that. It's, for example, if a lot of people might know or that use medicines regularly. Sorry. So of all, a lot of people might not know that of all the registered medicines, not even 50% are manufactured. So it goes beyond just the establishment of a regulatory authority. And it goes into a very complex territory. And it's important for the reason that for good health, you need to have good quality medicines. And it's an important part of, and research has shown that good medicine, a good part is an essential part of good human capital. Anyway, there have been, before this one, before I did this analysis, there have been two analysis of Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan. One was back in 2014 or 2015, which was pretty early because DRAP was founded in 2012. The other was in 2019, but that one, both of these were limited in the sense that they only looked at one or two aspects. For example, the 2019 study, it only looked at the quality of medicines. What I've done is that I've looked at an aggregate picture, an overall picture, and picked up 5 criteria, important ones, when it comes to medicines or drugs. Allopathic medicines are called drugs because if you are talking about medicines, that's a whole lot of other categories too, which includes Ayurvedic medicines and other ones too. Anyway, moving forward. Here is the basic structure of the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, DRAP. It basically is, supposedly is an autonomous body, but it's under the Ministry of National Health Services Coordination and Regulation. Whatever decision they take, it has to be coordinated or approved by MNHSCR, and then it goes to the cabinet, especially the pricing decisions, pricing of medicines. It has 12 subdivisions that include regulated work, through which they administer their work. Okay, I've chosen these 5 criteria for analysis. 1, quality of drugs and drug dispensing, consistency of policies, ease of conducting and doing business, research and development and supporting infrastructure, attracting investment, and are consumers better off than before. Now remember that all these 5 criteria, the basis for which I chose these criteria is that it addresses both the demand and the supply side. It's not one or it's not the other. So, and these are the basic issues, the big ones that affect this sector, the pharmaceutical industry and its regulation. So here's the first one, the quality of drugs and drug dispensing. Issues pertaining to substandard medicines are old and they do cause deaths. Remember that DRAP was founded after the famous case in Lahore Institute of Cardiology, where a lot of people died due to administering substandard medicines. That was back in 2012. And they still continue, the issues of substandard medicines. Issues of drug malfeasance, they do still persist. And here is a table of the data that I could collect. Just want to clarify 1 or 2 things over here, which is important to understand again. One, there is no centralized database or centralized repository of drugs and this kind of information. It's only part-time piecemeal data, and DRAP, people from DRAP weren't there, but they refused to share any data, and they had no central repository of data. Second, let's differentiate between substandard or less effective medicines and counterfeit medicines. Now, a lot of people use this terminology and cannot differentiate between that. Back in 2011, the Interior Minister stood up in National Assembly and said that at least 50% of the drugs being manufactured in Pakistan are counterfeit. If they were counterfeit, half of the population would be dead. Counterfeit, yes, they are manufactured, but they are a very, very small percentage of total medicines that are available in the market, less than even 1%. So it's substandard, it's less effective, but not counterfeit. So anyway, this is the data. You can see drug recalls, samples tested, how many were found to be substandard, spurious, some were unregistered. there were false warranties, and they were misbranded drugs. So, like misbranded drugs, they supposedly give out information about certain drug and it's a certain salt contained in it, but it won't be that. It would be something else. So it's kind of deceptive marketing too. You can call it that. Official data reflects an apparently better picture, but based primarily on batches bought from official health facilities. They don't necessarily go to the market, whatever tests they conduct. They take it from official health facilities, the official hospitals, which they buy. So DTS, the drug testing labs and bioequivalency labs are very few in Pakistan and not of international quality. We'll discuss this in the other slides too. Drug dispensing techniques and quality still questionable. Major portion of pharmacies still running without a quality pharmacist. That is what you would find in most of the Pakistan, except for maybe big markets. So consistency of policies. This is important for many reasons. One of them being that if you have consistency of policy and good policies, investors will only come then. Policies being run and modified through SROs, which is not surprising. It's nothing new in the government. Still a dominant mode of day-to-day operations. Little, if any, improvement compared to the pre-DRAP days. I've given an example, and there are many examples in the paper, which you come across whenever you read that. In April 2020, there were around 4 notifications regarding the manufacturing of hand sanitizers. But in the very next month, all those were cancelled through a notification. So this doesn't give much credence to the policies of the government. And this doesn't imbue any sense of security in a would-be investor or what they want to do. Next, ease of conducting or doing businesses. Considerable challenges still persist. Pricing is still the most contentious issue. From the price freeze policy between 2001 and 2013, rarely any drug was given a price increase. Government didn't allow any price increase in drugs, except for a very few cases. Those were called the hardship cases, and even they went through a very considerable time, a lengthy procedure. There were 2 new drug policies. There have been 2 new drug policies, one in 2015 and 2018, which brought in the concept of medicine prices being linked to consumer price index, and in 2018, new medicines being registered, being linked to reference prices of other countries like Bangladesh and India. But still, there are issues that persist between the industry and the regulator. Despite changes, pricing is still a government level prerogative, with cabinet's decision mandatory. If cabinet doesn't allow it, even if it is in the drug policy, that prices would increase automatically. But if the cabinet doesn't allow it, cabinet doesn't notify it, it won't increase and it won't cause some issues. And it is causing issues. Controlled prices, black market expansion, non-production of essential drugs. Those who use drugs regularly, medicines regularly, would notice something, those who have been using it for some time, that a lot of essential drugs tend to be not available in the market. This is an issue that has been going on for decades without any resolution, and it has a lot to do with the way pricing is done in Pakistan. Production, large number of steps required to set up and conduct business, can take anywhere between 3 to 4 years to get approval of a production plant in Pakistan. Compare this to countries pharmaceutical, which are pharmaceutical powerhouses like China, like India. They set up a plant, and after setting up a plant, the regulator comes in, sees whether all the criteria have been met or not. But in Pakistan, it's the opposite. You have to first get admission from DRAP to buy land and then set up a plant. And in doing that and in entering final production of a drug, it could take anywhere between 3 to 4 years. Drug registration and approval process can still take many years. On DRAP website, you would find medicines that are still have been there for 3 to 4 years, but have yet not been approved or disapproved. Contract manufacturing, it's an $11 billion industry in Pakistan, not even $5 million in Pakistan. Contract manufacturing is basically sourcing out manufacturing of drugs to other firms. 13 basic steps, this is an example, 13 basic steps involved in contract manufacturing. It should not be more than 1 or 2. That's what we find in other countries. Charges and taxes, litany of charges for work performed by DRAP or getting approval, large number of taxes on products, FED, VAT, import duty, income tax, clearing charges, port charges, all of this. Research and development and its supporting infrastructure. Without research and development and new and effective drugs or variants, not possible. But research and development needs supporting infrastructure and policies. Both are not existent in Pakistan. Just one thing, since 1976, government has been extracting 1% of tax equivalent to gross sales of the industry for the purpose of research and development. And nobody knows where that tax has gone, where that money has gone. But there is no supporting infrastructure in Pakistan. In all these years, we don't even have a single FDA-approved lab in Pakistan for testing drugs, which is the international gold standard. No research, 95% of APIs have to be imported, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Until COVID-19 struck, not a single vaccine was being manufactured or assembled in Pakistan. It's now being done in 1 or 2 places. Industry doing little or no research since government has taken it upon itself, but it's doing nothing. New API research, and it's an expensive endeavor. Industry is unwilling to do it because it pays for it. It pays the government to do the research, which it isn't. Attracting investment, here it is. Regulations have inside that your net FPDI, which means inflow minus outflow. That's a picture, and it's a very sad picture for a country like Pakistan, which could have been a gold mine. Back in 2006 or 7, McKinsey pointed out this industry as a sunshine industry, but this is the picture in front of you. Here you go. The difference between exports and imports increasing. Exports are down, imports up, and that distance keeps increasing. And it has increased even more with COVID-19. Are consumers better off than before? One of the reasons for regulating and strict regulation of markets given by the government is that it wants to work for the welfare of the people, but government's own statistics shows that out-of-pocket expenditure, that's from national health accounts. You can see that over time, those expenses have increased. So it's not working. Let's just say it's not working as it should be and as they planned. Black market in drugs is still very active, drug shortage is still a norm, and pharmacovigilance is unsatisfactory and pharmacy practices still lack quality. Aggregate sum, 2001 National Health Policy envisaged major improvements over previous regulatory practices. 2 decades on, overall improvement, but there is some improvement compared to what it was before, but most of the challenges still remain. Would need a major shift in thinking about regulation to optimize upon the potential of the industry. Thank you.
Mr. Shahid Mehmood, before going to Dr. Tariq Hussain or any question, we have somebody from CCP online. Can we have their question, please?
Can you please use the raise hand option? Thank you.
Mr. Ahmad Kadir from CCP.
Ahmad Kadir साहब को बुला लीजिए.
Ahmad Kadir sir, please proceed on.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to thank PIDE for this opportunity, and I just wanted to have make a few brief comments on the paper that was presented. I'm sorry I'm coming a little late into the conversation. Pehli baat to ye ke we have a Competition Act, so referring to the competition ordinance in the paper is factually and legally incorrect. एक सवाल फिर आया था कि कोर्ट के केसेस कंपटीशन कमीशन में कोर्ट्स का क्या मसला होता है. This is a very long story. It goes back to 2010-11, soon after the CCP was formed. जब ये 18th constitutional amendment आई और devolution की transferring powers to the provinces की बात आई, तो एक major objection जो competition commission के against लग गई थी courts में was that does the federal government have the right to impose a competition framework on the provinces? And it has taken more than a decade. In fact, ये October-November 2020 में finally Lahore High Court का फैसला आया है कि the federal government indeed has the right to have a federal competition law applicable to all provinces. तो 10 साल तो हमारे इसी बहस में लग गया. एक और चीज़ ये है कि कंपटीशन कमीशन की जो लॉ है इट इज़ बेस्ड ऑन OECD की शुरू में डॉक्टर तारिक हुसैन ने बात की थी our legal framework is very much based on the principles of the OECD because we wanted to have our competition law and there should be some sort of familiarity between our competition law and the international competition framework prevalent in most countries, and we have achieved that by closely mirroring the principles of the OECD competition framework. So ये चीज़ है. One other aspect is that we have a very limited budget from the government. You know, we have rarely exceeded 210 million rupees a year. And given that we have a very broad mandate and the 4 principles that have been presented by Dr. Fraz, I think, or in an economy comprising of 220 million people, I think a budget of 210 million doesn't go very far in sort of fighting court cases, doing investigations, doing inquiries. So there have been legal constraints, there have been financial constraints, but in spite of that, the Competition Commission has been a very open and transparent institution. If you go to our website, जितनी inquiries हुई हैं, जितने orders हुए हैं, जितनी quantum of penalty लगाई गई है, everything has been clearly defined and is available to the public. You know, the Competition Commission की जो reasoning है, that has been made available to all the people for review. So we have tried to be very, very transparent. If I have permission to just show one slide, if I can just share my screen. Administrator, can you just allow me to share my screen?
Sir, please proceed on.
Since we began in August 2007, the quantum of penalty in various sectors, I mean, this in itself is indicative of, you know, कि market में कितनी distortions or anti-competitive behavior है. But it also shows कि Competition Commission का ambit or regulatory role हर तकरीबन in almost every sector of Pakistan's economy, we have had some impact, even though the matter has gone to courts and maybe sub judice. But if you notice, telecom, cement, agriculture, banking, finance, automobile, real estate, education, you know, there is no sector of Pakistan's economy where the Competition Commission has not intervened and has taken action to the best of its abilities. So I just wanted to add a few words to clarify on this paper. I'd be very happy to work with PIDE to sort of make any necessary amendments to their excellent piece of work, so that these ground realities, the actual realities of the CCP's work can be reflected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We have Mr. Shahid Hafeezur. So please.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, very quickly, 2 points. One, just to remind ourselves, the paper very rightly talks about the price controls. Let us not forget that under the new mini budget, the raw material of the pharmaceutical industry is going to be taxed at 17%. Life would be very simple if the pharmaceutical industry would be declared as zero rated, but because it will not be, we have a real problem that we are likely to face going forward. So I'm just flagging it for those who are sitting here. Second point, I think one point that seems to be missed in this presentation is also the protection which is provided to the pharmaceutical industry. And I can give you several examples because I've been on the board of Shaukat Khanum. I'm right now on the board of the Haque National Hospital, but I'll give you a much more recent one. 2 weeks ago, because I assist in an institution which actually helps autistic children, there is a drug in Pakistan, no names are not important, which is fully protected and of course provides poor quality medication. And they are not being allowed to import the medication which will actually help the children. So, I mean, you know, these are 2 things I wanted to highlight. One, what is likely to happen to the price tag without DRAP adjusting these prices very, very quickly. Otherwise, we could have a problem on our hands immediately after the mini budget. And secondly, the protection aspect, which really hasn't come out from the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your question. We'll move to Dr. Tariq Hussain for his comments. Then we'll take all the questions and then we'll move to Mr. Shahid Mehmood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. I think Dr. Shahid at one stage used the word sad, and I think this is a sad story here. The paper starts by looking at DRAP and comparing it with its predecessor, the Drug Control Organization. So it says basically that DRAP is better than its predecessor, but that's where the good news ends, it seems, from the paper. It has a lot of empirical evidence and incisive insights regarding the policy environment. The paper says that it has been highly unstable and often subject to sudden ad hoc changes, one of which I think Mr. Shahid Kardar just pointed out. Regulations make it difficult to do business. Pricing, it is basically price control, has had negative repercussions for both the pharmaceutical industry and the consumers. People don't understand demand and supply, basically. And one result is that a large number of multinational companies have left Pakistan over a 20-year period, and even domestic firms have discontinued. I mean, so the industry is dying or it's being killed effectively for more than 20 years. That's the impression we get. I remember talking to chief executives of pharmaceutical firms, even in the late 90s, who were saying we are moving to Bangladesh. Nobody listens to us in the government. So I'm a bit surprised that in 2005, 6 or 7, McKinsey is calling it the sunshine industry. It had started on its path of decline in the late 90s, according to the multinational firms here. Another adverse consequence is low level of foreign investment. And this is where the paper makes a very persuasive case that it is price controls that lead to shortages and therefore higher prices in the black market. I mean, this is something, not just known theoretically, but accepted empirically across the world. You want to control prices to the extent that the industry disappears, then what will happen? So consumers are not better off than before. This point is highlighted in the paper. And then the paper also says something about what Dr. Hijazi was kind of referring to, that the government regulators lack adequate knowledge of the technical and industry matters. You're regulating an industry, you have to be better than them in terms of your expertise. And apparently that is not the case. Then this business of the research tax that the government has been collecting since 1976, billions of rupees, it has happened in a couple of other sectors also. It disappears. And now a paper points out that Pakistan is importing 95% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, mainly from India and China. So the overall conclusion is that DRAP is better than its predecessor, but needs a lot more improvement. Here, I did not give it was very interesting, Ahmed Qadir Saab saying that the Competition Act was made with close attention to OECD's laws and practices. So I'm wondering if DRAP also, was aligned with some international good practices, or was it just a local invention without any reference to, for example, OECD or other international good practices? It would be useful to know that from the authors. It has the study has several very sharp conclusions. And I think based on these, it should be possible to have some equally sharp, recommendations going forward. Thank you very much.
I think this is why we want to do the evaluation. Quite frankly, it is not quite clear. I think in all these cases, we should think about it. What do we mean by regulation? And that subject, Tariq, you should comment on. What do we mean by regulation? Because to me, regulation, to use an analogy, in the States, they call, out here, when you try and dictate the speed of a fan, you call it a regulator. In the States, they call it a dimmer. So the thing is the regulator a dimmer or is the regulator a promoter? I think it's very important. In this case, we see the regulator is a dimmer. The regulator is trying to control the market, not try to develop the market. Is it the job of, and this is the same thing on the SECP, I hope we do an evaluation of the SECP someday. The market has not been developed by the regulator. Regulator wants to control the market and kill the market. One of the ways it does it by price setting in an arbitrary fashion, not in any reasonable fashion. In any case, what is the need for price setting? We really don't know. We should think about it. Yes, there's a certain amount of price watching. Maybe that's important, to watch the price and see if there's something arbitrary happening, then you can take it up, but not setting the price. And how do you watch the price? That again comes to the role of the regulator. The role of the regulator is research and monitoring. Unfortunately, we don't take that to be the case. And the reason for the regulator, another thing, Shahid sir, which I don't see, the APIs you talked about, what about the generic industry? Pakistan doesn't seem to have a generic industry. It seems to have a local branding industry, which is a very strange way to look at it. We take the foreign brands and brand them locally, even though they're generic drugs. So in a sense, we're getting an excessive profit out of them, but there's no local generic industry. And the last thing is the fund. The fund, it prevails in every part of the government, the research fund, sorry, where the government takes telephones, cotton, exports, oil and gas, everywhere the government takes the fund for development of the sector, but nothing happens. Somebody should do some research, or should take up these funds and do some research on them too. See, the point is, a researcher's job is to lay bare facts and not just to simply put publications in the public domain. Thank you. You go ahead.
In fact, I'm from Drug Regulatory Authority. If you permit me, I want to add something. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Ubedullah, Director at DRAP, and it's very nice to interact with the PIDE. I think it's the second time in a year, first in the webinar, which was led by Dr. Nazim, and now it's the second time. So in fact, first I congratulate the author for presenting some facts about the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, and also admiring the fact that there is some, I think I will say, significant difference between our predecessor of Drug Control Administration and right now Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan. In fact, just if we see in the presentation, there are some factual corrections as well. Right now, there are 13 divisions. And if we talk about what is the role of regulatory authority when we talk about the drugs regulation, whether we are here to regulate the commerce and economy, as highlighted by you, or we are here to regulate and implement the safety, efficacy, and quality of any drug. So if we talk about the main preamble for the establishment of the authority, regulatory authority, it is the regulation of the safety, efficacy, and quality of the drug, not of the business. If now the question comes how the regulator is controlling the economy, so it is the factor of the pricing which we are discussing since the last 30 years, that DRAP should not control the price, and it's the second time last in the webinar as well, Dr. Nazim said. And definitely right now we are rather due to, by virtue of our law, Drug Act 1976 and DRAP Act 2012, we are bound to fix the price. And if we see our neighboring countries, as Shahid, your name is Shahid? Shahid has pointed out the availability of some essential drugs. One of the reasons for non-availability of the drug is the pricing mechanism as well. And India and Bangladesh, they are only regulating the essential medicines. So now coming to the some part of the presentation, because being a regulator, as I have already shared, that our main responsibility is the regulation of the safety, efficacy, and quality. And since 2012, our establishment, we are working for this component of the regulation. And in 2013, we didn't have any WHO pre-qualified lab, and now in the country we have 5 WHO pre-qualified labs. 50% of the government labs are WHO pre-qualified. I just want to correct Dr. Shahid that FDA do not approve any lab. FDA का काम नहीं है. It is only and only regulatory authority approval and labs by the World Health Organizations, and 5 of our labs in the country are the WHO approved. Now, if we compare ourselves with our neighboring countries, so probably Pakistan is the only country in the Sahel region having 5 WHO pre-qualified labs in the public sector. 1 point. Second point, you have mentioned about the drug dispensing without the pharmacies. Now it is again our law that the sale of drug is not the domain of DRAP. It is the commercial governments to regulate, and we are coordinating with our commercial governments to harmonize our legislation about the sale of drug, because we have 7 pieces of legislation for the sale of drug for every province, and ICT, GP, and AGK, and we are trying, and you are very much right, that this sale component is still to be addressed by the government as well. In fact, Shahid has mentioned about that it takes 3 to 4 years for the license and the registration. So probably if we talked about this 3 or 4 years pre-DRAP era, then definitely I will say that it was right. But now if this time duration has been shortened, and if any company who applies to DRAP for the grant of license, it takes 3 months after the submission of application. जब अपनी facility बना लेता है, because after the approval of layout plan, usually it takes about 2 years to construct a building. And then definitely these 2 years are not on the part of regulatory authority, it's on the part of the company. And similar is the case with the registration of the drug. It took 6 months. Now, after the 6 months, then definitely price fixation goes to the cabinet, and you can say in some cases, इसमें 1 साल भी लग जाता है, because preparation of a summary and up to the approval of the cabinet definitely takes time. So probably problem lies with the legislation कि हमें हर दवाई की कीमत fix करनी है और fix भी federal government ने करनी है, and federal government is the federal cabinet. Shahid has rightly pointed about what contract manufacturing policy. And if we see in our website, you see our website and all the things, we have revised our contract manufacturing policy 6 months back. It has been approved by the federal government, and probably previously to 8 steps थे, अब 2 steps procedure है for the contract manufacturing policy, for the approval of any contract manufacturing outsourcing of the drug. And we do hope that after such things, we will attract many investments as well. Now, Shahid has also pointed out, and our experts, about the attracting investment. So importantly, when we talk about the FDI, foreign direct investment, so definitely it's not only the Drug Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, which you can say, or we can say that is hindering the attraction of the foreign investment. There are many other factors जिसको हमें जरूर देखना चाहिए कि वो कौन से ऐसे फैक्टर्स हैं जिसकी वजह से foreign direct investments or investments from the multinational companies पाकिस्तान में नहीं आ रहे हैं. As far as DRAP is concerned, जो bottleneck का contract manufacturing policy that we have resolved. At the same time, one very important thing is the visibility of the regulatory authority about the decision making. So all of our processes, sequencing, SOPs and timelines are available on our website, and we are trying to comply. I will not say at all that DRAP is perfect, but we are trying to improve because it's evolution process and we are trying to get ourselves up to that level. Now coming to the international accreditation of DRAP. During last 5 years, we put ourselves for the international audits, and right now we have achieved 2 levels of WHO for our accreditation, and we do hope, as I already shared with you, that 5 of laboratories in the public sector has already been WHO pre-qualified, and as a regulatory authority, we will be pre-qualified, hopefully, inshallah, in the coming year, because we are working on that. So it's all about the our working. One thing which we have shared about the API import. Yes, it's very alarming situation, and in last 2 years we witnessed 2 things. One, when it was the our conflict with our neighbor India. India has stopped all the raw materials, and second month in the COVID situation. And 3 months back, DRAP has sent a summary to the federal government for the promotion of the pharmaceutical APIs in the Pakistan. So again, it is not only because for that very policy of the pharmaceutical APIs manufacturing, it's not only the regulatory authority, it's the State Bank as well, Ministry of Commerce, and various other science and technology initiatives as well. So we are already working on that. And again, a good news for all of us that in this COVID situation, we conducted first time in the history a 18,000 individuals clinical trial for our COVID vaccine, CanSino Biologics. That clinical trial was conducted in Pakistan, and we approved that very vaccine in Pakistan on the basis of indigenous trial and other as well. So we have started manufacturing vaccine as well, and during the last 3-4 months, we have also pitched Pakistan as a regional hub for the vaccine manufacturing as well. Thank you very much from my side.
Thank you so much. I think this was very enlightening. And what my remarks are going to be is actually to just encourage the research minds which are in the room, and what are some of the policy matters which could be supported by further research in the area. I think it's important to define some of the terms which have kept cropping up in the discussion which has just happened. When we use that, the predecessors were better or they were significantly better. So what does it actually mean? I think we need to define that, because there has been, since DRAP came in 2012, so what were some of the concrete things which have come into effect? What are some of the negatives? What were some of the positives? But I think we need to be specific around that. One of the things which I think would have been really useful, and we would encourage some further work onto that, because the Planning Commission is working on the National Development Frameworks, where we are looking at the legislations and the mandates which the federal and provincial governments hold across some of these subjects. So I was just trying to make a table over here as the discussion happened, but there's a thin line, when we talk about that the federal mandate around DRAP is on safety, efficacy, and quality. And then we say that the sale of drugs is a provincial mandate, but the sale of drug is very closely linked with safety, efficacy, and quality. So it's very important to define the federal and provincial roles. And it's also very important to define and map out the different entities which are involved in here and what are their roles in this context. And what are, again, for those roles, what things are in place and what still needs to be done. We talked of the cabinet for price fixation. There was a mention of State Bank, Ministry of Commerce. Again, for accreditation, what is the role of the federal, what is the federal role and what is the role for the provinces? And again, I think for attracting foreign investment, there was a mention of that there are several factors, and so there are several entities again. So our experience here at the Planning Commission, because we were working on the contraceptive commodities, and there's an extreme shortage, and we were looking into why are we not manufacturing them, and the government itself is a buyer. And there are several barriers to entry, and I think those barriers to entry again need to be thrashed down and to be seen that where we can, what sort of interventions need to come into effect in order for us to, encourage these investments to come in. There was a proposal that came to my desk, which was for hepatitis, and I think it was around 60 billion and 90 billion, 60 billion and 90% of the funds were for testing kits and for the treatment. And all those testing kits and the treatment was going to be imported, So if there is so much, money which is being asked for the things, and what is keeping, us from attracting local manufacturing in these areas? I think in the context of, it's important to, again, I was unable to figure out that who's establishing the standards for these pharmacies, who's regulating the pharmacists and the dispensers, their qualification, their curriculum, are they up to the mark? Because that's again linked to sales as well as to the safety efficacy that was mentioned by DRAP. So I was unable to figure out that whose domain it comes up as. So how do you certify, these pharmacies? It's very important. We are aware that we are selling almost everything on the shelf. And this has implications for the antimicrobial resistance, which is a very, very big challenge. So what is DRAP doing in that context, or what is the role of the provinces in that regard? So I think that's another area. The drug abuse is another very, very critical area. So how is the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmacies, are going to be regulated to avoid that? Again, I think in terms of policy, as I said, that there is a vague mention of the government level prerogatives and all, but this needs to be very, I think, specified in terms of that. For research and development, it's good to know that some sort of trials happened, but I think there is for antimicrobial resistance for COVID now. I remember that there was a trial which was to happen, and the Ministry of Health approached us, and we were unable to identify where the funds are available, where such trials. So I think it's important for the researchers to know, who are keen to undertake these critical trials, that where the funding is available. So the funding lapses, and they are unable to also identify where the resources are. So I think whose responsibility is it again? So is it the federal responsibility? Is it the responsibility of DRAP, the ministry, the planning commission? But I think that's again an area which needs to be demystified. Again, for attracting investment, I think there has been a mention of, the entry barriers and some, processes, but that's, I think, a very, very critical area to be thrashed further, and to come up with the specifics that how can we attract investments, and where have been the bottlenecks, and who's responsible, and what needs to be done, what the other countries have done, or what Pakistan was doing before and has stopped doing, or what Pakistan is not doing and needs to start doing. I think those specifics are important and have policy implications. And I think this entire evaluation, as it moves further, is going to help us in there. I think I'll stop here, and thank you so much. I think it was very insightful. Thank you.
If you permit me to make a few comments, I worked in the Planning Commission for 5 years, including for 1 year as member of social sciences also, apart from being member S&T, industries and so on. And I had a strong interaction with the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, we set up a advisory group, and a proposal and a policy paper was prepared back in 2006, 2007, I think. And many of the questions raised today, I think, are also discussed there. And certain pathways, certain guidelines, certain suggestions were made that this may be the route to go. Let me please come quickly to a few points, but before that, let me ask DRAP for one particular item. Data exclusivity law, has Pakistan signed on to that?
Still not.
Still not, please don't. In 2005, Mr. Alan Larson, ex-Assistant Secretary of State, ended up in my office, and he says, sign up on the data exclusivity law, and you will have a lot of investment coming in. And what was the exclusivity law? I said, sorry, we won't do it. The reason was, it's like an infinite extension of a patent. And a patent is meant to bring about innovation, not just to protect the person who's invented something, but not for very, very long. It used to be 3 years in the drug industry, then became 5, then 7. And he was asking at minimum 20 years. I said, sorry, not possible. So this is this is where the big pharma industry comes in. And this is also the reason why our exports have gone down. We noticed then about 85% of the pharmaceutical companies were making generic drugs in Pakistan, local industry. They didn't have the expertise or qualifications or the certification. So WHO certification, yes, was suggested it was cheaper. And in fact, FDA doesn't do it. And we suggested how they might be able to achieve WHO certification, and also ISO, good manufacturing practices on the shop floor, all these things. The issue is, we discovered then that the big pharma companies who were already only 15–20% presence in the country, they controlled major part of the drug manufacturing and the drug business. And what's more, if Pakistan wanted to export its own drugs from here, Southeast Asia or other places in Africa, it turned out that, say, GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, so on, or other companies, they already have an agreement when they came to Pakistan, and they have agreements in that country that they will only buy from the original company. So generic drugs can't go there. India separated itself from this business. They said no, they will, if something is made in Pakistan, in India, it can be exported. They are more than 35% of the EU market. And by the way, the Americans, it's not just the Indian market, but in America also, half the drugs sold are generic. So this is one way to go in Pakistan. And this is also one way the DRAP really comes in for certification, quality control, innovation, and so on. Testing. There's another question I would like to ask. A lot of tests take place on our population with vaccines and new drugs without the government knowing fully about it. Only doctors in government hospitals and private hospitals are involved, and pharmaceutical companies abroad, and they have their drugs tested here. This needs to be regulated. About imports, just a small comment. We started looking at the imports. I rightly pointed out that a lot of the APIs, the starting material, comes from abroad, and a lot from India. So I had the good or bad fortune I was in the Atomic Energy Commission, and one of the labs came under us at COP, Health Technique Corporation. This does radiation sterilization of medical products. And half the customers are in the south and half in the north. They sell their products and they send them to us. And depending on what kind of it is, they're giving gamma radiation doses. And then they are biologically, let's say, secure for 2 or 3 years, whatever the time period is, depending on the material that you're irradiating. So we made a thing called a safe delivery kit. And there were a lot of deaths, maternal deaths, during maternity and so on. Open up the kit, stir it up, you find a bar of soap, wash your hands, especially meant for midwives. Then put on gloves, sheet to put under the mother, and umbilical cords and surgical blades and others, what you call things to tie up and so on. All this, we started looking at these items also. We found that things are coming from India, labeled as a component, but they were fully made up things, and kits and so on. So all this was happening. So I'll just say this, and one other thing we noticed, syringes which are sold in the country, except for one, Becton B&D Dickinson, which company, the other many companies, they do, the syringes are not, let's say, cleaned up. And we visited them and asked them, what about this? And they said, hold on, these are new items. So why do you have to sterilize them? So there's a lot of problems in the pharmaceutical industry, in the pharmaceutical sector. But local manufacturing is possible, and this is where DRAP can come in. Coercion and enticement. Thank you.
Thank you. Due to time constraint, we're not going to take a few more questions in this, so I'll move to Mr. Shahid.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Umair, and thank you everybody for your wonderful comments. In my defense, the first thing that I want to highlight is that I had very little time to go through it. It's a almost 28-30 page research paper, and a lot of things are highlighted in that. So I couldn't come up with everything in the slides. I had little time. A few points, I'll just quickly go through all these points. That yes, it's as doctors have pointed out a few things was that DRAP is supposedly an independent body, but it's the cabinet that takes the decision, or the ministry that takes the decision, right? So they are bound somewhere. And as Dr. I mentioned, that overall, in aggregate, if you look at it, DRAP has done better than its predecessor, right? But there are also constraints. Now, regarding the few things that I would mention is, he mentioned contract manufacturing, APIs, then clinical trials, and everything. Issue is, for example, in contract manufacturing, yes, you have revised the policy, and I've mentioned that in the paper. The issue over here is, as I said, there is no guarantee that it's not going to be reversed. That has been happening quite often, right? So DRAP does take a decision, and a good decision, but there is no guarantee, DRAP cannot guarantee that the ministry or the cabinet won't revise that decision. And you'll have to be bound by that, right? So industry doesn't work that way. It's not an incentive that you issue a policy one day and within a month that policy is reversed. Nobody's going to come out like that. Yes, there are issues. Yes, there are issues at financial level, at state bank clearance or bank clearance and everything like that. But when it comes to regulator, when it comes to the industry, government should have a policy that it should stick with. It shouldn't be running on SROs. It's not going to work, right? And then obviously, yes, certain labs are now pre-qualified by WHO standard. But my point was that if you have to take this Pakistani manufactured medicines, especially the generic ones, to bigger markets like North America and others, then there is some standard. It's not exactly a accreditation, but FDA, it's a standard that everybody quotes. And it will have to come up with that. Then there is the transparency issues. Nobody knows, again, that the money has been extracted since 1976. Where did it go? There are no details. Nobody is willing to provide details, right? Where did all that money go? Similarly, one of the questions that I think it was Dr. Shahid who asked, the protection to pharma industry and small part. Yes, it does happen. There are examples. And again, it's an issue at regulators. And in fact, there was a new research on this. The Pakistan Business Council has had a detailed report with lumps. And there are quite a few examples in there where they raise this conflict of interest issue. So obviously one of the things that has to be taken care of. And last but not the least, the intellectual property laws. So you mentioned that. Yes, they are pretty weak. You can have implementation laws. You can say that somebody needs to implement these laws, data exclusivity laws. But even if there is a law, even if Pakistan signs it, how would they enforce it? There is no mechanism for enforcement. Thank you.
Maybe it'll be interesting debate we need to move.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahid Mehmood. Next, we are moving to evaluation of Naya Pakistan housing scheme. I would request Dr. Ayaz Ahmed to begin. Thank you.
Honorable Vice Chancellor PIDE and participants of this seminar. Today I am presenting my work on the evaluation of Naya Pakistan housing. Next, please. Presentation outline, introduction and background, needs for reforms and its probable effects upon the economy, main features of the Naya Pakistan housing program, progress till now, weaknesses and hindrances, suggestion for improvement. Introduction and background. The seriousness of the housing crisis in Pakistan can be judged by the fact that successive estimates put the backlog in housing at 9 million units, increasing by 300,000 units annually due to unmet demand. Because of the uncontrolled housing crisis, many families are forced to live in extreme conditions with unhealthy and unsafe homes. According to the United Nations, by 2030, more than half of Pakistan's estimated 250 million people are expected to live in cities compared to 36% now. The housing shortage in Pakistan requires an investment of $250 billion. Therefore, the government must provide solutions in terms of infrastructure and urban planning, land reform, policy resources and incentives for mixed use development and removal of regulatory barriers. According to the World Bank Pakistan Housing Finance Report, the private sector, builders, developers, building solution providers, banks, leasing companies and finance will have to consolidate their resources. The Naya Pakistan Housing and Development Authority has been established for planning, construction, managing program and development projects. In the offered plan, there are 3 installment plans under the system. Applicants can pay 5,000 rupees per month to 10,000 rupees. In the lowest category, 10,001 rupees to 15,000 rupees in medium term categories, and between 15,001 to rupees 20,000 in the top category. Now the land construction cost has increased over the past 10 years. This graph shows that in 2011, the per square feet cost of land is 1349. That means 1,349. And now 2021, 3,984. That is almost 3 times of the 2011 price of the land. Needs for reform is probable effects on the economy. Housing affordability and access to adequate land is significant problem in Pakistan. The total population of Pakistan is about 2007.7 million, with the number of households 32.2 million. That is Pakistan's Bureau of Statistics report 2017. Now the population is increased. That is 22 crore, 220 millions. Now the comparison of annual housing demand in selected Asian countries. In Pakistan, the annual housing demand is 10 million and India is 4 times of Pakistan, that is 40 million. Sri Lanka 50,000 to 1 lakh, Bangladesh only 0.659 million, Indonesia 0.35 million, Philippines 3.75 million. The World Bank estimates that the total national housing shortage is more than 10 million units, with a gap of 350,000 units in a year. Okay, sir. Okay. Now we will come to the main feature of the Naya Pakistan housing. The main objective of the Housing Task Force is to establish the full-fledged housing authority under the name of Naya Pakistan Housing and Development Authority. The aim of the current government will provide 50 lakh homes to Pakistan over the next 5 years. More than 70 related industries are linked with the housing because housing is such a huge labor-intensive sector. Now the housing department and related to the different provinces as well as the federal housing, government housing authority, Punjab housing and town planning, Sindh under progress, KPK provincial housing authority, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan provincial setup of Naya Pakistan housing yet to be established, Gilgit-Baltistan provides setup for Naya Pakistan housing is yet to be established, AJK physical planning and housing department. Now the promise-wise progress of Naya Pakistan housing. Federal government applies housing authority has launched a housing project in Islamabad for government employees. Punjab projects have been announced in Okara, Lodra, Bhawannagar, Faisalabad, Sialkot, Chishtia, Chaniot and Jhelum. Whereas since the housing scheme is under progress in the Sindh province, KPK, the land identification process has been initiated along with the reviewing its acquisition process for the housing program. Balochistan, a few housing projects have been announced by federal government. Gilgit-Baltistan, some housing projects have been announced by federal government housing authority. AJK Naya Pakistan housing has announced in Rawalakot and Palanli, only 2 districts of the Azad Jammu Kashmir. Weaknesses and hindrances. It underscored the government's concern about the slowdown in housing loans and that those who wish to become homeowners face difficulties in obtaining a bank loans. It shows that the central bank can now put more pressure on commercial banks that do not want to speed up the processing of loans applicants. In doing so, banks will be forced to borrow risky loans, even though central bank officials have repeatedly said that the state bank will only provide loans to expand the housing industry and that decision on credit risk will be taken by lenders. The housing development is highly dependent on the strong mortgage market, which is not the case here at all. Many countries have already overcome their housing shortage by creating a mortgage industry and providing the common people with a wide range of loans to buy or build a home. In terms of housing finance, the situation in Pakistan is much worse. With Pakistan standing lower in terms of mortgage to GDP ratio, the rate in Pakistan is less than 1%, while in India it is about 10%, Bangladesh is 5%, and in other countries in the region such as Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, rates are consistently rising, reflects significant house finance activities as compared to the Pakistan. Pakistan only rate is 1%. In the case of Pakistan, even more than 70 years after the country was born, the House Building Finance Corporation is the only housing finance company. The housing program will not start in a big way until we have to mortgage industry. That will always be a dream of government does not tighten fund to protect banks from potential losses. Now the suggestion for improvement. There are two key policy measures that can significantly enhance the current proposed policy interventions for Naya Pakistan Housing and Development Authority. First one is the city development reforms. Second is the mortgage policy for middle income group. From a regulatory and legal point of view, this is a very hard nut to crack. City management is divided. For example, Karachi planning and municipal plan consist of 20 federal, provincial and local agencies with different legal and administrative structures and minimal institutional coordination. Local governments may exist but do not have the authority to make their decisions, being to various agencies and authorities. This fragile institutional alignment among agents make city management ineffective when trying to create space for land development. For example, about 90% of urban land. Mortgage finance policy for middle income group. The middle income group for households that earn more than low income group and workers in the formal sector such as doctors, college, university teachers, professionals working for companies. Such lenders can provide sufficient proof of their current income, further income potential and net worth to qualify for a mortgage. Currently, the housing shortage is estimated at 10 million units. It can be assumed that the middle income group make up largest percentage affected by the deficit. However, both State Bank of Pakistan and Naya Pakistan Housing Development Authority have been provided any indication of interest in this vital segment and are thus silent on any kind of bespoke policy framework for the middle income families. Thanks.
Hussain and Dr. Your comments.
The impression one gets is that this is another sad story. Low-cost housing in Pakistan. Although here the discussion is about the Naya Pakistan Housing Initiative, which aims to build about 5 million units in 5 years, as against the shortage of 10 million units estimated, about half of them in the urban areas. So the paper mentions the official announcements of housing schemes under this initiative, but we don't find data on the actual achievements. Maybe data are not available. In the paper anticipates several problems in making Naya Pakistan effective. And most of them are deep-rooted problems that have been present for a long time. So in view of this background, the impression is that the prognosis for Naya Pakistan is not encouraging. And then the paper talks about the kind of reforms that are needed to address the housing shortage. So it's actually more about the housing shortage than about Naya Pakistan. Two areas of concern just mentioned. One of them is urban planning, which, as the paper shows, we all know, I think, living in the cities, it has a complicated institutional context for a long time. But in recent decades, it has also developed a stubborn political economy. I think all of us know what happens in the land market and who's involved and what's going on. So this is one problem. And this stands in the way of this sensible recommendation that there should be densification through high-rise buildings to lower prices and increase housing availability. Very sort of an intractable barrier there. The second is in the financial markets, where paper talks about mortgage financing for lower middle income groups and daily wage earners, which is ambitious. And at the end, we are left with the impression that that policies are lacking to move decisively in these areas. So the end is a bleak scenario. And I think that's all one can say about it. Thank you.
I think this is another area where poor research has led to poor policy. Yasab, I don't believe that there's a 10 million housing shortage. I think a World Bank estimate, just kabhi estimate needs examination. First thing, this needs real evaluation. I don't see people sleeping on the streets. I don't see there's a huge shortage of housing. In fact, if anything, everybody is living in a structured household. Kachi abadis, etc., are not that large. So quite frankly, first number we should challenge is this 10 million housing shortage, which has also led the government to put up a misconceived policy. Second issue that you have also not used PIDE's own research. We've been arguing for densification, high rise, as Tariq said, for a long time. We've been saying city zoning is the problem, not housing shortage. There's no housing shortage. There's a housing shortage, if at all, it has been developed by city zoning, because city does not think that a flat is a house. You're also taking this thing that 3 marla house is a house. I submit that the days of marla are gone. Days of marla were my great-grandfather's days. Today, we have to live in flats because quite frankly, 250 million people can't live in marlas, because otherwise you'll have no land left to do anything and you'll be driving around in cars forever. So I think that's the second thing. The third thing that we've talked about, the paper that we wrote about in PIDE on the Prime Minister's construction package. And also we mentioned in that mortgages are going to be very difficult. Mortgages require secure incomes, mortgages require a good banking sector, mortgages require an income value ratio that is absurd, which can't happen in this country. So a lot of stuff that needs to be done to be thought out. Thank you.
Just one small comment. Dr. Nadeem has pointed out the excellent work that PIDE has done, but there's one little thing which I call the S and W factor, which gets missing in all the housing projects, policies, sewerage and water. I pity Sindh. We are just sending a refuse down and please let's get over this fixation we have that anything which flows, if water is flowing in we can put a sewerage in it, it'll be cleaned up. It doesn't happen that way. 550 million gallons per day is taken in by Karachi. Not a single drop is recycled. In Istanbul, not a single unrecycled drop is put into the sea. It has secondary uses. So this is one thing that nobody talks about in the housing programs and projects, and water recycling. That's all. Thank you.
Dr. Hijaz.
Regarding this housing specifically, I was reading a study where it says in the urban, about 60% of the population live in less than 2 marlas of a house. So when we are talking about new housing colonies, we are always talking about 5 marlas, 10 marlas and higher. And I agree with Dr. Nadeem because, like the way population is increasing, flats and, multiple heights, residential system. Secondly, one thing when you're talking about authority, I think something is very important to see that, in the previous discussion in the DRAP, the governors, the board of governors of licensing authority has got 14 members, and 7 of them were appointees. And I was doing a research in which there are 1,377 board members in Pakistan, and 85% of them are appointed by different ministries and so on, retired government servants. So no specialization. What Tariq Hasan has mentioned, there's no specialization there. Again, I think the same will be in this housing where there's no question. Nobody has talked about, number one, low-cost housing. I mean, the word is low-cost housing, and the whole project is not talking about any sort of indigenous research on production material where the cost of the house could go down. Secondly, they talk about Islamization, and then everything is based on interest. And again, putting 5% interest rate is actually creating a distortion in the market, because over time, the return to the investment will be unjustified, and other part of the family will be, other part of the society will be adversely affected by this distortion. So I think the governance issue is very important, because people who are regulating the authority, who is running it, have to be professionally competent to do that. One last point is that I think probably, as partly Dr. Nadeem mentioned, we have got a very good private sector housing system in Pakistan, very good housing society. Beria town is managed much better than Islamabad. So why to go and make another Islamabad? Why not to make another Beria? Why not to help the private sector to create housing rather than to go for another high cost own structure? Thank you.
Thank you. We do have somebody from CDA here.
CDA वाले तो हमारे साथ आके बैठे ना, ये तो हमारे माशाल्लाह कंटिन्यू है। इधर आ जाए सर, इधर आ जाए प्लीज। आपके बगैर हम कैसे गुजारा करेंगे?
We would like your comments, please. We would like to hear from you, your comments.
First, I would like to introduce myself. So my name is Junaid. I am working in CDA, Unlocust Housing Societies. So
the current project that we have at Fraz town, where we have been constructed more than 3,000 apartments. So I would like to talk something about that. If you want to. Okay, thank you. The title of our project is Development of Low-Cost Housing at Fraz Model Town, Islamabad, for the residents of Kachiabadis, F6, F7 and beneficiaries of NEPRA registered and for open action. First, I would like to give the background knowledge that why we need housing societies in major cities. According to the United Nations Development Program, Pakistan has the highest rate of urbanization in South Asia, with 36.4% of the population living in urban areas. The UN estimates that by 2025, nearly half of the country's inhabitants will be living in cities. So the main factor is migration from rural areas. Another is to seek livelihoods and access to better services such as education and healthcare. Also, the relationship between urbanization and growth are not automatic. We know that urbanization in many developing countries has occurred without growth, jobs, and productivity. Unplanned and unmanaged urbanization has rather resulted in urban slums, environmental degradation, poverty, and inequality. Pakistan too is confronted with a host of urban challenges. Pakistan has a huge housing deficit of nearly 10 million units and growing. Urban population growing in the country has not been matched by growth in housing units or equitable access to land, resulting in housing shortage and growth of slums. Pakistan is currently facing an overall housing backlog of 11 to 12 million. housing units. The urban housing shortage is estimated to be around 4 million.
We would like to hear your comments on the paper presented.
ये इस तरह करेंगे, आपको पाइड के एक वेबिनार पे बुलाएंगे, आप ये पेश कर दीजिएगा जरूर, बड़ी अच्छी बात है, हम जरूर सुनेंगे। बट द क्वेश्चन रियली इज इस वक्त कि हम ये बात करें नया पाकिस्तान हाउसिंग अथॉरिटी की, इस पे कुछ आपने कहना है तो बताइए, जो पेपर था।
अच्छा सर, इस पे मेरा ये कमेंट है कि हम वहाँ पे तो हाउस सोसाइटी बना रहे हैं ना,
हाउस सोसाइटीज़ बना रहे हैं ना फ्राज टाउन में, जो कि 4000 अपार्टमेंट हो गए, लेकिन इसकी जो F6 F7 की जो कच्ची आबादी है उसके लिए लाइवलीहुड के लिए हमने क्या प्लान किया है?
We have Dr. Kardar's question online, so can we have that?
बोलिए बोलिए बोलिए।
Dr. sir, please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
जी जी।
Yes sir.
Achani, very quickly, much of what I wanted to say has been very well summarized by Nadeem. So I'll just add two things very quickly. One, it is striking that the Naya Pakistan housing scheme also thinks in terms of horizontal expansion rather than the vertical part. So it's fascinating to me that other than all this discussion which is being taking place on the PIDE platform and otherwise, the Naya Pakistan housing scheme is still stuck with a horizontal expansion of housing. Second, let me make a small prediction. The number of transactions in properties, frankly, are now up against a huge problem that we will face. Nadeem and I have talked about it quite regularly in a different context, that if FPR has, if I go in and actually do a transaction in land with a developer or in a house with a developer, the only information that he takes from me is my CNIC. Nadeem, wait for the best part. And let me make a prediction. Starting before the start of the next budget, they will now, FPR will insist under AML laws that the developer actually insists on the buyer providing information on his salary, his tax return, and what else? Yes, tax return, salary, and of course a wealth statement for the reconciliation. A job which FBR is supposed to do will now have to be done by the developer. I can assure you, apart from the fact that none of us would want to share that information with anyone, more importantly, we will now not have a market for land and housing, but much more in the form of files that we are all aware of, files being traded. So I'm just flagging something which is likely to happen very soon.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question. Please make it short and then we'll move to Dr. Ayaz.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Alina Tahir, Associate at Re-Nurture. I would just like to raise two concerns. So in this paper, we have repeatedly talked about mortgages. We're talking about a lot of financial products that the people will have to use. But looking at the beneficiaries or the borrowers of this Naya Pakistan scheme, we have not talked about the financial literacy of the people who will be receiving these financial products, especially when we talk about loans and people who from the low income group. Do they have any capacity building programs targeted for them that would enable them to go to commercial banks and use these services? I do not think that we are working on the financial literacy side of the people who are on the demand side of the scheme, and without having awareness in the people that we are targeting the scheme for, I don't think it is going to be successful, because they will not know the terms and conditions for what they are signing up for. And secondly, I would just like to reiterate the fact that environmental concerns are not being treated in this effort to promote a new wave of construction. And as we're seeing in the case of Rabi urban development as well, that without doing any proper EIAs or proper assessments of how our watersheds and other areas are being affected by this construction, I think promoting low-income housing would just further deteriorate the problem, because more people have money and they will just use it to probably solidify the buildings that they are currently living in, and that will not be proper urban planning. So I think these are two major concerns that we should look into.
Thank you, Dina. Dr. Ayaz.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to reply that girl's question about the people's awareness. Poor people, as well as the middle class people, all people, low middle class, all people are well aware of
that they have to have their own hosting units. They are always that's no, that is the issue of the paying capacity. That is a separate issue. But awareness is there. Poor people are more worried about their own hosting unit rather than the upper middle class. Upper middle class sometimes says we are very much touching to the current life, quality of life, rather than the house. हाउस हम अगले बच्चों को दे देंगे हमने क्या एंजॉय किया लाइफ में वो अपने उस एंगल से सोचते हैं so far as the mortgage finance so far as the high-rise buildings are concerned that was given in my slides but I can't explain due to the shortage of time. No, the per unit cost is more than per unit cost of hosting units is more than double than the flats. Flats cost is almost less than half as compared to the other points I will incorporate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll move to next session of papers. They are NEPRA and Prime Minister's construction package. First, we'll move to Ms. Afia Malik for NEPRA's evaluation, and we do have Deputy Director and Legal Advisor of NEPRA in the hall. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My job is to evaluate NEPRA, National Electric Power Regulatory Authority. NEPRA was established under the regulation of generation, transmission. Next slide, please. Mansoor, next slide. NEPRA was established under the regulation of generation, transmission, and distribution of Electric Power Act 1997 to regulate the electricity services in Pakistan. In 2018, NEPRA Act was amended to create a legal basis for the development of a competitive electricity market by 2023. Under the 1997 Act, NEPRA's policy guidelines revolve around cost-effective tariff structures to ensure investment in the short run, expansion of generation, transmission, and distribution capacities in the long run to meet the growing demand for energy, and to ensure a reliable provision of electricity to consumers. But under the amended Act, NEPRA's responsibilities have increased, not only to regulate the generation, transmission, and distribution of electric power and related matters, but to ensure high standards of transparent, certain, and effective regulation of the electric power market of Pakistan, specification of the legal framework within which a competitive electric power market can develop and sustain, and to manage a conflict of interest between the state and the development of the market. The objective of this evaluation was to identify flaws in the current regulatory infrastructure and to suggest ways to improve. This evaluation, for this evaluations, I have chosen 4 basic areas: organizational structure, regulatory framework of NEPRA, regulatory governance, and the effectiveness of regulatory framework. Different sets of questions were answered in each section.
Thank you.
There was no perception survey, but it was a case study approach. Case study approach was used and my data was selected from the interviews to interactive sessions with official sets of authorities as well as from the sector experts and the government officials. I also rely on the secondary data sources. Next. So first, I studied the organizational structure itself. Third slide. NEPRA is basically a quasi-judicial to regulate power sector, to issue licenses, to determine tariffs, monitor for maintenance of proper standards and quality of service, and to address the complaints of consumers. The main governing body is the authority comprising of chairman and 4 members from each province. In the new Act, power sector experience is given preference in the selection of the chairman and 4 members, which is a positive change. And to make a quorum for decision-making, the authority must have 3 members. Currently, NEPRA is working without member Punjab for more than 6 months. He was a retired member from the district management group. Whereas the other 3 members and the current chairman, they are all engineers with experience directly and indirectly in the power sector. The law says that the authority may delegate its power to the chairman, any member or any of its officers, or a special tribunal constituted, or any of its power to carry out its functional duties. However, in practice, decision-making is only at the top. Various departments at NEPRA only provide input whenever it is required. And over the years, NEPRA has become increasingly more centralized, overburdening authority in routine matters which otherwise could have been discussed at the divisional level. And the result is increase in regulatory meetings on every matter, which not only delays decisions but affects its quality. In the last fiscal year, 542 regulatory meetings were held, apart from 142 regulatory hearings. In public hearings, due process of consultation with all the stakeholders, including consumers, is followed. However, it is observed by the experts that the time allocated to general consumers is relatively small. NEPRA is designed with various departments corresponding to each of its basic function of the regulatory body, as in the Act 1997, that is licensing, tariff, consumer affairs, complaint, and monitoring and enforcement. Besides, there are several other supporting departments. But after the amendment, no significant change is observed to support the development of a competitive electricity market. The key challenge in this setup is the lack of communication across various units. Though the staff at NEPRA claims that a good communication exists between various units and staff members when required to respond to organizational priorities. But the fact is, also confirmed by various experts, most issues and discussions take place at the managerial level among individual departments. There is no coordination among them. Next. Enhances human resources, that is to appoint employees, consultants, experts, advisors on such terms and conditions as the authority deems. But it is found that organization is incapacitated in terms of professionals for competent working at the authority. For example, international consultants are engaged in evaluating IGSEP or CTBCM, billing and supply regimes, etc. And because of the lack of competent staff with the regulatory knowledge, experience, and training, there is inadequacy in emergency planning, in the preparation to take part in the national decision-making and communication concerning power sector challenges. Delays was observed in preparing the regulatory framework required for the establishment and development of a competitive market. A significant number of pending court cases also indicates a shortage of sound legal team at NEPRA. This was also confirmed by ex-NEPRA officials. Current chairman mentioned in his message in the last annual report that online training program on different subjects were developed for the employees to enhance their professional skills, but its impact is yet to be seen. To be effective, NEPRA as a regulatory body is required to have some regulatory standards, regulatory guides, and internal guidance to be used for the regulatory staff. This suite of documentation not only needs to exist, but it needs to be reviewed regularly and updated according to the need. But the answer what I received from the NEPRA officials was NEPRA is no different from other organizations in Pakistan. Next. This table is about the budgetary details of NEPRA. At present, an annual license fee and filling fees for direct applications is the main source of income. Under total administrative expenses, salaries and benefits account for 76% to 80% in the last 5 to 6 years. Whereas the budget allocated for training and development or capacity building of the staff remained 1% or less of the total administrative expenses. This whole budget is approved by the authority, which is the governing body, and the audit of annual accounts of NEPRA is carried out by the Auditor General of Pakistan. Similarly, an external audit of NEPRA accounts is also carried out annually by some well-reputed chartered accountant firm, and this initiative by NEPRA needs appreciation as NEPRA is not bound by Act to do so. Since the promulgation of the Finance Act 2012, NEPRA is required to deposit its surplus funds, fines, and penalties with the Federal Consolidated Fund of the Government of Pakistan. The authority claims that this is not affecting its financial planning and management. But in future, the amendment may hamper in maintaining high human resource standards, IT systems, research and development activities, extensive consultations with stakeholders, etc. Next. Next is the regulatory framework. To be effective, NEPRA needs to have processes to deliver licensing, determine tariff, monitoring, review, and assessment and enforcement functions. Within the broader framework of the 1997 Act, NEPRA has described rules, regulations, and guidelines codes to oversee the power sector. Processes are defined in the NEPRA regulatory framework. But after the amendment in Act, as in Act says, distribution will be separate from the electricity supply by 2023, which requires new standards, rules, and regulations. Similarly, a competitive market is envisaged to be developed by 2023. It requires the secondary legislative instrument notified. This Act requires the secondary legislative instrument notified before 2018 to be brought in line with the amended Act within 1 year from the date of coming into effect of this amended Act. However, 3 years have passed, but the requisites are not in place. There are delays in the finalization of all the rules, regulations, guidelines required for the market. So far, only 3 relevant regulations have been notified. Still, 11 new regulations, 4 new performance standard regulations, several of the amendments are required to be specified and notified. The processes as defined in these rules regulations, they allow for a timely response as rules and regulations guidance clearly mention the time frame. It is only the capability of the organization that can ensure that all its regulatory decisions and requirements are met in a timely and correct manner. The constraint at NEPRA is the lack of ability to carry out its functions in a timely manner. According to the Act, NEPRA, it is the prerogative of the federal government to make rules. Authority can only recommend or ask for it, but the government must consult the authority and the provincial government. While NEPRA has powers to formulate regulations, issue directives, codes, guidelines, circulars, or notifications. So it means regulations and codes, all are these under NEPRA's control, but there are still delays in their specification and notification. Next. Regarding licenses, in the case of licensing, not only process is cumbersome in terms of documentation required, in most of the cases, the time taken in making the final decision is more than what is prescribed in the rule. For instance, in the case of generation license to IBPs, the determination took more than a year in some cases against the 4 months allowed time. Penalties for violating contractual terms are seldom applied. As per law, NEPRA needs to ensure that the generation plants are operational in compliance with the respective generation licenses. The proper checks and balance process must be in place, which so far is missing. In the generation licensing decision, contrary to the rules, the professional ability of an operator to execute the project, financial and technical feasibility of the project are reviewed, but no focus to check the capacity required or towards fuel mix. Officials in NEPRA complain about the non-availability of national electricity plan to guide them. Market entry regulatory framework has remained weak in Pakistan, mainly due to the limited role of NEPRA in power purchase agreements. The prices and guarantees offered to new entrants in the generation sector did not allow competition among the generation companies. Contrary to NEPRA regulation, which says that the review and approval of a project are based on least cost consideration, new contracts have been justified in filling the demand and supply deficit. NEPRA, I think I have more time.
5 more minutes.
Okay. Next is the tariff determination. Tariff determined by NEPRA is forwarded to the NEPRA tariff was standard the procedure rules provide guidance for processes and parameters for setting tariffs. In the amended Act, NEPRA determined a uniform tariff for distribution licenses wholly owned and controlled by the common shareholder based on the consolidated accounts. NEPRA is bound to take guidance from National Electricity Policy to determine, modify, and revise rates charges. In other words, tariff structure in Pakistan is not based on regional and consumer-specific long-run marginal costs, but is used as an instrument to achieve political and social economic objectives. Over the years, determination process has seen issues in terms of delays and the regulator not allowed to enforce. As a result, the determined tariff is not based on actual cost of service. Apart from monthly fuel adjustment, NEPRA allow for quarterly adjustment in the determined tariff of the disclosed. This is the result of regulatory failure. As it is made with disclosed, as it is made when disclosed, do not use the allowed energy quota and ask for a quarterly adjustment. So instead of regulating the disclosed, the burden is transferred to the consumers. But on the whole, for both licenses and tariff determination, it would be unfair to attribute all issues to NEPRA. Sometimes delays are from the side of licenses or because of legal challenges or government intervention due to the political considerations. But still, it is primarily the regulator which will have to take the responsibility and lead reform in this area, especially in terms of providing guidelines and solutions. Next. In general, enforcement mechanism is extremely weak in NEPRA. Fines are rarely applied. Also, there is no consistent approach to apply penalty if the company fails to meet standards. No evidence of recovery of these fines. NEPRA role is limited to sending an advisory to the government with reference to disclosed performance. The authority itself is unable to enforce performance standards. Next slide. Under the amended act, the regulator has been granted powers to monitor and enforce the competitive market. However, the amendments only provide a legal basis for developing a competitive electricity market, legal guidelines for guaranteeing the regulatory performance. The successful transition towards a competitive market requires de facto regulatory performance, which is dependent on significant preparation not only at NEPRA, but all other related agencies. It requires new pricing and procurement tools, new software at each entity, capacity building of staff to enable them to handle market forces while meeting the basic objective to supply electricity to consumers. Various departments at NEPRA are not yet ready for this change. Management has little knowledge of different competitive market models, their strengths and weaknesses. NEPRA's expertise to supervise long-term bilateral contracts and spot purchasing is minimal at present. Next. Regarding this is about the regulatory governance. Regarding independence, NEPRA is autonomous organization under the cabinet division. What the act says, but going through various clauses, it is found that amendment in the law where have given powers and some factors have compromised regulatory independence in majority of the other factors. Next. In terms of expertise and credibility, in the past, NEPRA leadership had problems in terms of regulatory expertise as people from bureaucracy or military didn't have the power sector background. By the time the regulator may develop some understanding of the complexities of the sector, his tenure is over. With reference to the other staff, NEPRA has not been able to develop expertise in relevant areas that can facilitate effective intervention in the future. Direct involvement of ministers, bureaucrats in pricing and licensing decisions can affect regulatory credibility and investment decisions, as what happened in the case of Sibet power projects. And in the absence of regulatory credibility, investors being aware of organizational risks associated with investment demand high tariffs, as happened in the case of IPPs, to compensate for increases. So it means all these sectors are affecting the credibility and not sharp. Regarding the clarity of roles, powers, and functions are spelled out in the Act. It is clear that NEPRA will aid and advise the federal government in the formulation of the national electricity plan. But regarding tariff, its role is contradictory. NEPRA is supposed to ensure efficient tariff structures and market design for sufficient liquidity in the power market, while the authority is allowed to determine a uniform tariff for the distribution licenses. Efficiency cannot be ensured through uniform tariffs. Next, effectiveness. What ultimately matters are the sector outcomes, not regulatory processes, institutional characteristics, or regulatory governance. The key objective behind the formation of NEPRA was to develop and pursue a regulatory framework to improve efficiency and reliability and to provide affordable electricity to consumers while protecting the interests of consumers, investors, and operators equally. Besides, to facilitate the transition from a protected monopoly structure to a competitive environment was also the mandate of NEPRA Act 1997. But in all these areas, NEPRA has failed badly. Next. Weak administrative governance in NEPRA, overall institutional inability to carry out the desired functions, effectively. NEPRA is lacking in professional expertise to supervise and control the power sector as well as the powers to establish a rational pricing regime. Being the regulator, it was NEPRA's job for resolving all the problems in the power sector, including system losses, increasing costs and high tariffs. It is the outcome of regulatory oversight that the circular debt emerged for the first time in 2006. An overall assessment of NEPRA regulatory performance indicates that the overall delivery performance is satisfactory in terms of regulations all are in place, but indicating a regulatory system with many of the necessary requisites for the power sector, but only under the 1997 Act. After the amendment, new regulatory framework is not introduced. But coming to the de facto performance, it highlights a significantly poor regulatory functioning in practice. NEPRA, being an autonomous organization, didn't make serious efforts to improve regulatory infrastructure in the power sector. Thank you.
I will ask Dr. Tariq Hussain to give us comments, and then we'll move to representatives of NEPRA.
Shouldn't NEPRA colleagues speak first?
All right, sir. All right. We have Mr. Noor Salim, Deputy Director of NEPRA, and their legal advisor. So please.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Muhammad legal advisor in NEPRA. Well, the presentation is too critical about NEPRA, and there are power crises we have seen in like historically and in present times as well. First of all, I would like to say that organizational structure has been changed for the new basically the NEPRA Act has been changed on that administrative side, like that organizational structure. The members coming from the provinces now the Parliament through the Amendment Act has basically devised a different framework. Now the functional members will come, like the member technical, member development, member law, and member commercial, and it has been notified last month. So this is the very basis of the structure of NEPRA authority. And another thing I have to point out that about 60 to 70% power sector is basically held by state-owned entities. They include generation side, transmission side, and predominantly distribution side as well. So these are the main things I want to point out in this presentation.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Noor Salim Khan. I'm Additional Director Licensing. I have observed a few points which I would like to share. First of all, Ms. Afia has mentioned what I have noted about delegation of power in NEPRA. It is fully in practice in NEPRA except in two areas, that is tariff and licensing, which are cannot be delegated under the Act. Otherwise, delegation of power from the authority is in practice in NEPRA. Second thing is regarding capacity, where it mentioned consultants. We are required, whenever required, NEPRA appoints consultant. In case of CTVCM, we have international level consultant has been hired through World Bank, and in the case of IGSF, there was no requirement. Internal expertise was enough for that, so we did not appoint any consultant there. Again, the report has mentioned that we are not prepared for the upcoming market, and in this particular case, specifically mentioned that regulations or required regulations not in place. In this case, 12 critical regulations were required. Out of them, 11 are 3 have been notified, 10 are in place for public consultation. Only one regulation is not notified for public, that is under completion by the by Ms. Beatrice. That's again an international consultant who is preparing these regulations.
Regarding rules and regulations, I would like to say that actually there is a procedure prescribed in that our NEPRA Act, that you have to consult the stakeholders and you have to go through public consultation through that publication of these rules and regulations through that print media. So all we are following all these procedures, and that definitely takes time, because at the time when this new law came into being in 2018, there were about the power sector has been basically reformed into an into the competitive market, where there is a trade of that electricity commodity into wholesale market. So that's why all we are doing is to build our capacity of our of that our that employees, and that also to that encourage our newcomers to cope up with the new basically paradigm shift on that aspect.
One thing more I would like to highlight, that it has been mentioned that licensing processing is taking very much time. Being in licensing department, I have been working there for more than 10 years. There is no lack on part of license demand. The main cause of delay is the non-submission of information or required documents by the applicant, and that specific time is not included in these 4 months. That's why in some cases it gets more than 6 months, 7 months, up to years. And again, one point you mentioned that regarding readiness and upcoming implementation of CTBCM in 2023. Actually, CTBCM is being implemented by April 2022, and NEPRA is very much ready for that. We are very zealingly following that. Again, you mentioned regarding regulatory governance. You have work insight on that. In this regard, I would like to request that for evaluating the regulatory governance, you have considered very few attributes. Many major attributes, like you can say legitimacy, public consultation, and making public decision public. Such attributes should also be considered, that are very positive in case of NEPRA. Otherwise, your study is very much thorough, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Regarding the delay in tariff determination, that it takes so long to determine the tariff, I would like to point out that there is a difference between determination of tariff and that notification of tariff. So determination of tariff is basically on NEPRA's part, but basically the notification of tariff is on government's part. So that in the past there have been delayed in notification of tariff by government for that 2 years. So that means that as far as NEPRA is concerned, we are doing our job according to the NEPRA Act and the timelines given in this NEPRA Act. Another aspect about governance issues in different distribution companies, NEPRA in consultation with the government and that advisory, we have the government has basically reconstituted their boards and brought the professional directors in that, and that and basically independent directors as well in these boards.
I think it's encouraging to see that we have participation from the organizations that have been evaluated. I'm going to start moving into some general points now. First of all, I mean, this paper itself is huge and thorough. I think it's probably 2 papers in the making. I'll tell you briefly why. But before that, as a matter of principle, one of the international evaluation principles is called partnership. And that means partnership with evaluation stakeholders, particularly those who are being evaluated. And that means engaging them in getting information and facts right. What I try to do is make it a point, if I have any apparently adverse or critical observation about an entity I'm evaluating, I will first go to that entity for a clarification. And independence does not mean isolation. We're entitled to our own assessments. But by the time we put a product in the public domain, there should not be factual errors being challenged by those who are being evaluated. I mean, the good practice is get your facts right. You know, journalists do that. You listen to all these debates, they verify their news, their information from the sources. So I think that has been, I know many of the papers do include interaction with those who were being evaluated, but perhaps, you know, again, I say, if you want to go in the direction of evaluation, you have to take the international principles seriously and professionally. And partnership with the evaluation stakeholders is one of them. Getting your facts right is one of them. You can disagree on matters of assessment and opinion. You're independent. But at least it is the obligation of the evaluator to get the facts right. And in a number of cases, this has come up today. This is not a discussion. Clarification of facts should not be happening in a public forum. It should be integral to the research and evaluation process. Now, as far as this evaluation is concerned, we have, at the end, I counted 16 recommendations. About half of them have to do with human resources management. More staff, different staff, better staff, add a research wing, in-house litigation, etc. Another 4 have to do with efficiency, and another 3-4 are about transparency and accountability. All seem to be reasonable. Now, what we are getting into here is, you can call them business processes. And this paper is very clear. It says, in addition to looking at outcomes, NEPRA should have key performance indicators for its internal efficiency and human resource development. This is a separate thesis altogether. It's not coming out clearly from the evaluation. Maybe I respect the facts and the knowledge that are in the paper, but it's not coming out. And this is very difficult to do in evaluations. We are not professionally trained to look at the HR process, the procurement process, the IT and communication process, the governance process. Now, if we want to get into those so-called business processes, we should form teams with people who have the required expertise to get into those processes. We're commenting on things that are beyond our professional expertise. And they are very important, I agree. And every time I'm presented with an evaluation request that says, look at personnel matters, I say, excuse me, this is not an evaluator's job. It is not. Go to an HR firm. It doesn't mean it's unimportant. It means, you know, living within your pool of your expertise area and the guidelines. Similarly, audit. It is not an evaluator's job. Legal hassles, not an evaluation subject, if you follow the principles of international evaluation. So we have to now decide going forward, you know, which way we want to cut it. Are we going to make 2 papers out of this, one on business processes, HR, efficiency, the other on outcomes, or make it more manageable? And there is a lot there for 2 papers, I say. But perhaps, you know, we should be realistic going forward and make sharper conclusions and recommendations for things we can handle in a manageable and professional way. I'll bring some of these points up at the end. Thank you.
Quick point. I'll just make 5 quick points. One is this quasi-judicial. I remember the chairman NEPRA saying that to me in a meeting with the finance minister when I was deputy chairman. I don't know what quasi-judicial is, and I don't know why a regulator should be quasi-judicial. Second point I don't seem to understand is why do we have hearings? A regulator's job is not to have hearings. And I think quite frankly, this needs to be discontinued and thought about. Third point that I like to make, Afia, is we should have a box on how NEPRA handles circular debt. Let's try and figure out if we can what has been the role of NEPRA in the circular debt story and how is it handled that. And NEPRA regards in the quasi-judicial thing, NEPRA thinks it's a tariff-setting body. Technically speaking, we should be very clear, a regulator should not be setting tariffs. A regulator should work itself out of the system of setting tariffs. I don't care what the law says. The law needs amendment. It's a regulator's job to get the law amended to get into a modern system. Because remember, Pakistan is suffering because of energy or whichever sector, DRAP even. So we should make sure that they are not setting tariffs. They are absolutely getting to the job, which is regulating, but regulation means developing a market, which is important. Final point, it has been 24 years. And if you're still relying on international consultants, so if you're still relying on the World Bank and we have no local capacity, that is a worry. I think it's time that Pakistan realizes it's 73 years old. It is a large country. It has to develop its own ideas and not rely on regulators. Thank you.
Not rely on donor consultants.
No,
regulators.
Very difficult to add anything after all these discussions in the original paper. But I'll just raise one issue very quick. Circular debt. We hear about circular debt a lot. Has anybody broken down the components of the circular debt? I have. Except the last 2 years, I've been lecturing regularly on energy and everything else policies, and its generation and transmission at the National Management School in Lahore. 1/3, actually it's not the total amount given, actually it's only about 1/3. The fuel people, the generation companies, the users. If the user doesn't pay to the GENCO, can't pay to the fuel people. And this comes to 1/3 really. And this is the basic cause of this thing. And you know who is the biggest culprit in non-payment of its bills? The government itself is the biggest single defaulter. Secondly, very nice to talk about India's regulation and so on, but you have to regulate something. And as pointed out here, regulate the delivery of energy and power. So what kind of energy and power? How do you choose it? How do you sign contracts? Why do we have these capacity factors still built in? Has anybody tried to take up K Electric or the old Haque and so on? Why are we still paying for the capacity, but they don't generate? And those that can generate, they don't have this contract. They don't have the HR, not in the NEPRA, but in the generation plants to actually generate electricity. Faisalabad is working at FESCO is about what? Federal electricity supply company about 25% capacity, availability factor. Nuclear power plants 90%. What's the reason? Manpower. So there are a lot of factors involved. Regulation is not enough. It is the delivery and then the feedback from there. All these matter. Okay.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Afia, and after that, we'll take all the questions after all three presentations. So after Ms. Afia's answer, we'll move to Ms. Lubna for presentation.
Only one thing regarding checking the facts. Actually, nothing is reported here without confirming from the NEPRA officials. This again proves my point that there is a zero coordination among various departments. एक department एक बात कहता है और दूसरा department आप इसको deny कर रहे हैं, तो इसका मतलब है कि there is something wrong with us. The NEPRA organizations, क्योंकि यहाँ पे कोई भी चीज ऐसी रिपोर्ट नहीं की गई है जो which I have not confirmed from the NEPRA officials.
एक सिंगल पॉइंट में आपको कहूँगा, जिस तरह आपने डिले प्रोसेसिंग की बात की है ना, अगर उसमें एक पॉइंट को ही देखे थे कि प्रोसेस लाइसेंसिंग में जो डिले हो रहा है वो रेगुलेशन में क्लियरली मेंशन है. अगर एक एप्लीकेंट जो रिक्वायर्ड इंफॉर्मेशन आपको नहीं दे रहा है स्पेसिफिक टाइम पे, हम उसको रिजेक्ट नहीं करते हैं, होल्ड पे रखते हैं. वही रेगुलेशन में मेंशन है. उसके लिए आपको बताया भी गया था जो डिपार्टमेंट से पूछने की जरूरत नहीं थी. इस तरह की बातें हैं, मजीद तो नहीं.
देखिए, can we please not do a bilateral? देखिए, इसमें एक process है. The organization concerned is to be requested to appoint a focal person. Okay. it is their responsibility to guide you to the right people. I know you have done a lot of consultation. Now, this needs education on both sides. So I know nobody does it deliberately, but the process has to be given. We've just started on evaluation. Please look carefully at the international guidelines and protocols so that these things are streamlined. That's all.
Thank you. Now we'll move to Ms. Lubna's presentation, Prime Minister's Construction Package and Evaluation by Lubna, Hasan, Hanzla, Jaleel, and Hafeezur Rahman Hadi. Ms. Lubna, please.
Assalamu alaikum and thank you. We are evaluating. Okay. Yeah. So we are evaluating the Prime Minister Construction Package. It's a flagship project of the current government. And PTI promised in its election manifesto to provide jobs and homes to large segments of the population. The package was announced in April 2020 and promulgated by the presidential order on April 17th, and then given legal order, legal cover through Finance Act 2020. The package was received with much zeal as many demands of the construction sectors were accepted. It was given a status of an industry. Fixed tax regime was imposed on it. It was investment were exempted from screening of the sources of income, and any investment in the low-cost housing was given an exemption of 90% of taxes. Oh, okay, we have it. Exemption from withholding taxes barring steel and cement, and a 30 billion mortgage subsidy for low-income housing. So for this evaluation, we used a mixed methodology. We looked at the wider economy factors to understand the formal and informal practices that would affect the relevance and effectiveness of the program. And we also carried out a small perception survey to gain perspective of the end user of the package to gauge user satisfaction. So why this program? Pakistan, Dr. Nadeem would not agree with it, but Pakistan faces a serious shortage of housing. And the current estimate, as Ayaz said, is about 10 to 20 million. And according to government sources, it would go up to 20 million by 2025. Construction is an important sector of the economy. It contributes 2.5% to the GDP. And if we include all the multiplier effect and the auxiliary industries, the contribution goes up to about 10%. It's a labor-intensive sector as compared to its contribution to GDP, which hovers around 2.5%. It absorbs a relatively large share of labor, which is 7.6% of the total labor force. And the package was announced in the midst of COVID pandemic when businesses were closed and economic activity was down, and construction sector was seen as one ray of hope which would provide livelihood opportunities to the downtrodden. So I'll begin with the output first, and then explain why such low response at this package. This is per government sources. Okay, so 2,225 projects were registered with FPR with a total investment of 493 billion rupees, which is given our GDP, this is not at all what the government would have expected. And out of these 125 projects, only 1321 persons had registered with the FBR. So in a population of 220 million, only 1321 persons had registered with the FBR, which is a very dismal picture to say the least. And out of the registered projects, only 1775 were new and the 350 were ongoing projects. So overall, I think it was not a very, let's say, overwhelming response from the construction sector. So why? So we look at we've looked at the effectiveness of the package, which doesn't come out nicely. Now we look at the things or the market inefficiency, regulatory barriers, or informal practices that should have been considered before this package to make it a success. The first thing is that our housing market is dysfunctional. It's not a question of the number of houses, but access to these houses. This graph shows that 12% of the population has access to around 56% of the houses, and only 68% population has access to 1% of houses. So we have a housing market which is very pro-rich and anti-poor. I think this factor was not taken into consideration. Then construction sector is heavily regulated and controlled, and PIDE has said it many times that the regulation burden needs to go down. The procedure and permissions required for constructions are extensive and complex. And if you apply, for example, in Karachi, a builder has to apply for 20 NOC before he can start his work. There are absence of land records, title deeds, and it renders construction permit a tedious and time-consuming job. The regulatory structure is also not well defined. A developer faces different regulators spanning across different tiers of government and across different development authorities. Each development authority has its own set of rules and procedures that makes the life of a builder and developer quite difficult. Another thing is that we call it, it's a term coined by Dr. Nadeemullah, that we have a market for plot. If you look at the graph, it shows the percentage increase in property prices between June 13 and June 2018. The prices have gone, plots have gone substantially higher than the prices of house. So people would rather invest in a plot and gain more profit in the coming years than buy a house, simply because it's more profitable. And this is one of the reasons why we have a market for plot. It's a convoluted system because we have a DC rate, we have a market rate. So people buy market rate, which is much higher than a DC rate for evaluation of land. So people buy land at market rate and register it at DC rate, and then it's a way of whitening, not only whitening their money, but it also leads to speculative forces in the land market, and most of the poor people are not able to, take part in it. It puts it beyond the reach of the poor class. Another factor which is not beyond the control of the government is that prices of all raw materials have increased by more than 70% during the last 1 year. the overall construction cost has gone up from about 2,500 to 4,000 rupees per square feet across the country. About 50 to 60% of the construction activity in the country has come to a standstill. So whatever boost was given initially has waned off, and 60% of the construction activity has come to a standstill. Ayaz has discussed the price of plots are also increasing. So we did a small perception survey in a cantonment area in Rawalpindi to understand what people perceive and what they're, if they're benefiting from the package. So people, one of the complaints was that the project is time bound. Yeah, I'll finish. And the construction is a slow, time-consuming process. It takes 1 year to get construction permits. Construction material has become costlier, and there's a big gap in the package amount. 5 Marla house costs around 10 million to 15 million, whereas the mortgage financing is around 2.7 million, making even a 5 Marla house without out of the reach of the poor. There's a perception that the package is for upper middle class and not for the poor. All the interviewees had used their own resources and not relied on the mortgage financing. And interesting point that came out was that they wanted authorities to allow purchase of old houses which are cheaper, and poor people, they want to shift into their house immediately and not buy a land and then construct a house. Maybe they don't have that facility. So the key message that comes out of this evaluation is that, yeah, it has not gone down well, but the construction package in silos is not effective, and it's like a market where there are buyers and no sellers. And the key to increasing housing and jobs is urban development and economic activity, which creates buying power for the people and who can then save and purchase a house. So what I'm missing from the reform package are these essential elements of reform. And PIDE has time and again talked about these essential elements of reform. It's one is that it was mentioned earlier that we have to move towards high-rise mixed-use construction, because in a high-rise mixed-use construction, people mobility costs are reduced. People can live near to their jobs, and poor people especially want to live near the job. And this package does not pinpoint to a specific housing type. So the investors are mostly moving towards the urban sprawl, and in Karachi, especially Ahmad had bought land in an area where there was no public transport. So even if they built houses, who would live there? The second point that PIDE has flashed again and again is that flat is the unit of living in large cities. So by building tall cities, you divide the cost of land, and it's a cheaper source of houses. Third is urban regeneration. The city centers are dying, and if they're allowed to build tall buildings, not very tall, maybe like Paris has done, a medium-rise building, then you can increase the density and maybe, and also the, shelter for poor in the city centers. Then is deregulation. Our construction sector is heavily regulated, and it's time that we move towards easing of process or ease of doing business. And I'll just end my presentation here. Thank you.
We'll take all the questions if you have any after all the presentations. So let's move to Dr. Tariq Hussain.
very briefly, I mean, you can see the overlap with the earlier paper on Naya Pakistan. I think the challenge for both of these papers is the context. So if you want to evaluate a program, I think we should focus on the program, and the context you can refer to by saying it's complicated as previous research shows, or look at an annex. In both cases, we are going way beyond the program package because, of course, the context is so complicated, but it's a challenge. So let me talk specifically about the program, the package. Three objectives the paper points out. One is to reduce the housing shortage through affordable housing. Second is to generate economic activity, and the third is to provide employment. Now, 1,070 projects, the paper says, worth 383 billion rupees have been registered with the FPR. The unstated objective, she has mentioned in her paper, to, how do you put it, to whiten black money. Okay. So, you know, a lot of interest eventually, it seems. But, and also some signs that there is greater financing and cement sales, which indicate that some stimulus has taken place for the construction sector. So when it comes to affordable housing, for all the reasons you've heard, the evidence is that the impact of the package would be minimal, if anything. So second objective, not achieved, not likely to be achieved. And for reasons, for the challenges that the paper has presented. And also the other aspect is, you know, if you want to move towards urban regeneration, high-rise mixed use construction, deregulation, etc., clarity of jurisdiction in managing cities, these are much broader and longer-term agenda for reform than what the construction package has offered. Now, they do deserve serious consideration, but my submission to the authors of this and the other paper, Naya Pakistan, is, I mean, perhaps if you want to evaluate something specific in a package or a policy, you know, find a way to focus on that. Otherwise, the longer term agenda, and you can do two papers again. So that's all I have to say on this.
We have next presentation on by Fahd Zulfiqar and Fida Fahd Zulfiqar will be presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to present the regulatory body PEMRA. So PEMRA was established as a response to the PEMRA ordinance, which was institutionalized in 2002, and okay. And its mandate was essentially about improving the standards of information, education, and entertainment, providing a wider choice of news and current affairs, as well as about ensuring that there is an easy access across the board in the rural and urban areas. And it was also about ensuring good governance based on the principles of accountability and transparency. And in order to achieve these objectives, PEMRA was authorized to primarily function with two regulatory tools in the capacity of a regulatory authority. One is about regulating the market, and the second one is about regulating the content, the media content. Regulating the media market was about issuing the licenses to private sector and distribution stations, international, national, local levels. And was also about making sure that there is enough space for the proliferation of different types of media firms and businesses, small scale, large scale, or middle range. So to create a more level playing field, and was also to make sure that there are no informational asymmetries across the board, and also to make sure that no monopolies or the group of dominant or concentration of a certain private media broadcasting happens. So this was their role, its role about regulating the market. The another regulatory rule was about regulating the content, which primarily was about playing the role. Is about playing the role of more censorship, policing, and inspection in terms of revoking, actually issuing the licenses, the revoking licenses, cancellation of the licenses, charging fines, and Also to make sure that the content which is being broadcasted does not really hurt the core of the national integrity and the social fabric of the country. So from the literature, 5 key areas have been identified as the problem. This is what the existing body of scholarship says, that there are issues pertaining to governance, which essentially are related to regulatory deterrence and co-governance, enforcement mechanisms, and compromise mechanisms. Another important identified problem is the regulation of broadcast media. Is it justified or is it not? There are 2 positions on it. One school of thought says that it should be free from the state control, and another school of thought says that broadcast media being a public good should be regulated because it has enough over expansion of the private broadcast media, and it also keeps a check on the quality and quantity of news. Another important area of interest which primarily comes from the law perspective is questioning whether PEMRA is independent as a regulatory authority or not. Another important problem is the trust deficit between the licensees and the PEMRA. Since there is too much of back and forth in terms of the issuing licenses, revoking it, reiterating it, increasing it. So it creates a trust deficit between the licensees as well as PEMRA. Another important problem which we have identified from the literature is the broadcast sector turning into oligopoly. Is PEMRA supporting broadcast sector turning into an oligopoly, which in the later part of the presentation we will discuss that it actually is. And also about the design and the structure. Based on these problems, what we have done is we have outlined objectives which we wanted to achieve through this research, through this work study. The first one is about to study the statutory status and the role of PEMRA. The second one is about to study its organogram and explain the structure and dynamics therein. And the third one, which essentially was about bringing in the evaluative framework to explain the aims and objectives and articulate the same with the outcome. In order to achieve these objectives, the methodology was qualitative in nature. Case study research design was used. We collected the data from the documents as the secondary data, sources, and as well as individuals. The PEMRA acts in current employees, and we had to taken consent. Informed consent was taken with all the respondents in the really disclosing the identity of the respondents. We had taken consent that the verbatim transcripts and the translations would be used in the findings of the study. We collected data using from individuals using the clinical based on this interview and then edited it. And we used two analytical methods, the document analysis and the framework analysis. So going by the document analysis, primarily there are 3 Word documents which PEMRA had to follow. The first one is the Ordinance Act 2002, the Amendment Act 2007, and then the Amendment Act 2018. So on the right is the box, which is an excerpt from the PEMRA Amendment Act 2018. On the left, it's an extract from the PEMRA Ordinance 2002. And over the span of 16 years, nothing has really changed rather than reinforcing the intangible ways the government footprint has been increased. For instance, if you look at the right box, that the government will write the policy, the federal government. The federal government will provide solutions in case of ambiguities and questions. Out of 12 members of the NEPRA committee, 9 will be elected or by the federal government. So the foothold of the federal government is too strong and too heavy, and that essentially provides a reason as to why the independent status of the regulatory authority has been put to question. Yeah. Again, going by the document analysis, if you go to the PEMRA ordinance in Article 5 and 6, and this section 8 talks about justifying as to why the reinforcement power of the federal government should be too strong, and that creates a problem in terms of driving the entire national narrative. So that whatever the narrative of the federal government is of the ruling parties, that becomes the national narrative, whether it's true, it's untrue, it's incremental, it's instrumental, it's right or wrong, is it a reality or is it manufactured? The second issue pertains to the sections, the subsection 2 of the ordinance, which talks about the criteria for appointment of the board chairman. Now, the document says no technical expertise and experience in the field of media, business, economics, or the law. And it's very rare that a regulatory authority which is meant to be made for the media, for the regulation of the electronic media content is really the person from the media. And that was the recurrent theme of our interviews as well. And it's very rare that the chairperson is from the media. We believe that it's a big criteria which is subjectively defined, and there's a political economy aspect as well. Also, in literature, these are called the de jure and de facto powers. By de jure power, we mean the federal government and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting regulating the media content through the regulatory authority, that is PEMRA. And by the de facto power, we mean that these two bodies are using PEMRA as a pawn to distort the media market, which in turn facilitates the creation and rather the proliferation of the oligopolies in the world and the monopolization process. It actually facilitates the monopolization process. In theory, the federal government will appoint one member and last two members, whereas on actual practice, the federal government appoints three members and three ex officio members, which constitute the 6 members out of the 9 members of the federal government chooses. Also, the Article 23 dropped at length about is about the monopolization, that it actually facilitates the big corporate media groups to take a major chunk, and then through that they will limit more, and in many cases made custom news that would tailor to their agendas. And also it keep the smaller firms out of the business. So what the data we had collected, one of the major things was about the data which we had collected actually corroborates the document analysis, because one of the respondents is identifying the issues in the documents, that the licensees have objections, the channels have objections, periodic operators have objections, and the last sentence of that stuff is very interesting because the document binds PEMRA to follow Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, even in cases where it doesn't agree with the ministry's decision. The second one is a very important question, that is PEMRA a regulator of the media market, or is it the regulator of the media content, which again is about compromising the decision-making power, or the autonomous of the independent decision-making power. Over the years, it seems as if it has stifled its regulatory power only to doing the censorship business rather than regulating the media market. The third one is again about the censorship issues. For instance, there is this one sentence. Declaring someone after of the God is not a development of the other person. Only the court of law or the parliament can do that. On the other hand, talking about blasphemy and sectarian issues will not be discussed as per the country's law, just like the Holocaust will not be discussed. But one feels that such freedoms are too restricted. PEMRA cannot do anything because it is not sovereign. It is just a state organ which follows the law of the parliament. Another important thing was that since PEMRA is so much regulated by the federal government and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, that why they should be a regulatory authority at first place. So one of the respondents was that you don't say that these regulatory authorities should shut down when there are functional ministries of petroleum and electricity in case of Auckland. Ministry cannot be a regulator. Only when it should be separated from Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. But I think there should be a regulator. How much power it should have, this is a debatable question. So there is a kind of a dichotomy in the responses. At one point in time, this excerpt is talking about how important it is to separate a regulatory authority from the ministry. And on the other point, it's also justifying its simultaneous existence with the existing structures. Another important thing was about questioning the organogram. For instance, one respondent said, the appointments of PEMRA are more political than based on merit and representation. Law doesn't prohibit hiring media person in PEMRA, but the federal government had not introduced media person because they wanted to employ their people. Now, the respondent had a very firm tone of voice when he talked about their people. And it has been headed by the non-media people, either bureaucrats or police. That's why they could not take long-term decisions to improve policies and implementation frameworks. And there is a severe underrepresentation from the media. Also, the findings are about the dichotomy of the harbor. You make an organization independent by making its head an authority independent, not by giving the authority to make law. The dichotomization of power as well as the separation of what tasks is what we need. This is in relation to what the ministry should do, what the federal government should do, and what the regulatory body should do. There is an unnecessary intertwining of the three for various reasons. One of the reasons is the element of politicization of the economy. Also, about with the relation, the mandate talks about its regulatory role as a surveillance body and as the regulator of the media market, as the regulator of the media market. So it talks about that PEMRA has circumscribed its role to only functioning as a surveillance body, not as a regulatory body which can create a level playing field for the media channels and the private broadcasting media. Another important thing was that since we've been talking about the monopolization and the over concentration of the private media sector in Pakistan, one of the ways through which a few broadcasting media sectors have made a monopoly is through the rating system. The rating system actually facilitates that process. There is an analog rating system, there is a digital rating system. Unless we move towards the process with the digitalization, the analog system will factor in only the ratings of those media houses which already have a major chunk in the private broadcasting media sector, and that these two excels actually support. So we would say that with response to the PEMRA Act, formal institutional change is required. Also, literally trying to have not explained, but there are extremely vague over terms in the acts and ordinances. For example, public interest. One just want to talk at length about what public interest is, who does it cater to, how does the regulatory authority play its role in defining and outlining the nomenclature, the rubrics, and the standards of what the public interest is. The issue of censorship is too much focused by PEMRA, which it really strips off its responsibility of regulating the media market. Also, there's a need to be change organizational structure, which we had talked about in the earlier slides. And unless we move towards digitalization, the process will be facilitating, the analog process will be facilitating the solicitation of the monopolies. Thank you. That's from our side.
So I'll just take a minute. The main conclusions, as I've read in the paper, are as follows. First of all, the legal and regulatory framework or structure is based on a mentality of controlling and policing. 1 point. Second, PEMRA has not come up to the need to upgrade laws for the digital era. Third, it has not prevented oligopolies that impede the entry of new content creators and media houses. And fourth, it is unable to prevent undue government intervention in the media. So then the paper notes that several changes are required to make PEMRA independent from the political and economic control of the government. Fair enough. And then somewhere it says, the political forces in power and the federal government do not have the incentive to make PEMRA an autonomous institution. And this leaves us with a question, should we then shut up for another 10, 20, 50 years? If this is what is needed and you're saying it's nobody's incentive to make it happen, well, what next? And it's as simple as that. I mean, there are people better than us who have talked about PEMRA and the role of the government in the media and so on. So I think we need to either surrender now and give up this discussion, or come up with something, incisive and powerful, or whatever you want, to bring it to the attention of the various stakeholders. This is one sector in which every individual has a stake, more than perhaps many other sectors. So it's a big challenge for, excellent work here, but let's see where you want to take us from here. Thank you.
I think one thing that I'd like to say is, I think we have to be very clear PEMRA is a very difficult organization to set up or evaluate. What do we expect from PEMRA? There should be a media market. It's really contributed greatly to growth in the last 20 years. Media market has contributed to growth a lot. We can see that. So let's see, how can we better the media market? And what is the media market? So I haven't quite understood what PEMRA's objectives are. For example, when setting up the market, The role of the rating, which you talked about, but needs to be thought about. Should rating be a competitive business? The role of the cable operators, should cable operators be a competitive business? The role of the content providers, is there a content provider business or not? Are we giving licenses only for these news shows? It seems we're giving license only for news shows, which is giving certain lobbies power to influence policy. Is PEMRA even thinking about it? Has PEMRA even got a clue as to what's happening? So I think these are issues that also need to be thought about. Do we have anybody from PEMRA who can respond?
They are under government control.
No, nobody from PEMRA, Fiza?
No, I think there's nobody from PEMRA.
Nobody from PEMRA. Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Let's move to the last presentation of the day. That's SME sector in Pakistan, mapping the policy framework, opportunities and constraints, presented by Ms. Sabanwar.
Thank you, Fiza. So our study explores the policy framework, opportunities and constraints faced by small and medium enterprises in Pakistan. We also covered the perspectives of policymakers, policy facilitators, and the SMEs. The roadmap of presentation, introduction. Let me start with the definitions of SMEs. According to National SME Policy 2007, SME is defined as an enterprise with an employment size up to 250, capital of rupees 25 million, and annual sales up to rupees 250 million. The SBP, the State Bank of Pakistan, defines SME based on the global guidelines of the headcount and the capital investment. For SPPs, a small firm is the one with employees not exceeding 50 and the investment of 25 million maximum. Whereas the medium-scale company can have employees no more than 250 and their capital investment can be up to 200 million maximum. While Punjab Small Industries Corporation defines small-scale business of cottage industries with fixed investment up to rupees 20 million. The list goes on. The chambers, particularly the Islamabad Chambers of Commerce and Industries, they don't treat SME as a different entity. They start accepting registration of firms with NTN having a minimal annual turnover of rupees 50 million. They register firms irrespective of any distinction and neither follow the SME policy definition. The Chamber of Small Industries and Small Traders, they register businesses with NTN and annual turnover between PKR 2 to 20 million, which falls under no official definitions. So the first thing that we want to emphasize on this point is that there's no agreement on the definition of SME. Unless the SME sector is not defined properly, it is rather difficult to target, support, monitor, and evaluate what kind of support is required for this sector. SMEs are important, we all know that. The literature highlights that SME plays a significant role in economic growth acceleration in both developed and developing countries. SMEs assist in employment generation, innovation, and value addition in the production cycle. With this, SMEs facilitate entrepreneurship, helps in poverty alleviation, assist in export-led growth, and boost trade through product diversification. The literature highlights a positive relationship between economic growth and SMEs' share in the gross domestic product of the economy, which is evident from its share of contribution in the developed countries. However, it is important to highlight that there are factors that play a significant role in the development of SMEs themselves, including the macroeconomic environment, government policies for new investment, structural characteristics of the economy, and microeconomic factors of the organization, the enterprises themselves. For our methodology, this study undertakes an extensive review of the literature, including research articles, research reports, and other policy documents available on the SME sector in Pakistan. Secondly, intensive interviews were conducted with the important stakeholders, that is Sameta Head Office, Technical Education and Vocational Training Authority, Punjab Small Industries Corporation, Islamabad Chambers of Small Traders Industries, Last but not the least, to explore and learn from the perspective of SMEs, manufacturers were also interviewed about the opportunities, challenges, and expectations. We have interviewed SMEs in textile, blue pottery, and food processing. Let us go to the finding and discussion section. The results in the finding section of the study clearly states the role of each stakeholder in the SME ecosystem. Let me briefly talk about these. As a facilitator to develop SME in the country, the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority was formed in 1998 under the Ministry of Industries and Production. SMEDA was established to work as a pivot for streamlining SMEs and is facilitating SME operation and growth through several programs. Its efficacy, though, needs to be reassessed after the 18th Constitutional Amendment. Other important stakeholders working as a facilitator for SME are chambers. All these serve as the contact organization at the district level for SMEDA, Ministry, and SMEs. Then we have Punjab Small Industries Corporation, another important stakeholder. This has been a sound contributor to the development of small industries in the province through its various schemes. The organization provides loans to small-scale industries. Then we have Technical Education and Vocational Training Authority, Delta. This is also a very important facilitator for SMEs, which provide technical and vocational education for a productive and competitive labor force in Punjab. There are 18 institutes of Tevita in Multan, including the Institute of Technology, Blue Pottery, Technical Training Centers, and Vocational Training Centers for both men and women. The role of Tevita is very important in enhancing the skill set of the SMEs. The findings of the study revealed that the officials are well aware of the prospects for SMEs. Medium-sized enterprises were relatively more aware and wanted to expand their businesses nevertheless. Small-scale enterprises were not aware of the market condition and future expansions, mainly due to a lack of education, finances, and small size in the market. Generally, they're not aware that there are opportunities to access finances, skills, training, and emerging opportunities through registration with SMEDA can probably reduce the cost of doing business. The SME being unaware don't register with SMEDA or any other stakeholder in the SME ecosystem. The unregistered business remain out of the radar. The avoidance from registration varies across the size, as the medium-sized units are registered somewhere as a compulsion. Now, what is the major hurdle in the registration of small enterprises in addition to the lack of awareness? The incentive for registration depends upon the pros and cons of being documented. As long as the pros do not exceed the cons, the registration will not take place. The cost of doing business immediately increases as enterprise is registered, so the cons are very, very high. There are genuine hurdles. For instance, 32 departments visit each installation, which increases the compliance cost, thus requiring serious intervention here. Because of this avoidance to register, there is no exhaustive list of the total number of the SMEs, and particularly of each sector. So all entities have only registered enterprises. There is no data on single proprietorship and the home-based businesses. Our findings also talked about the SME policy. The new SME policy has not been finalized yet. The SME policy implemented currently in the country is the policy that came out in 2007. The problem is that even after 14 years, the 2007 outdated policy is still intact. It is now very important to have an updated policy with a proper implementation plan to facilitate the SMCs in the country. It is a must to have an official SME policy to align all the policies and determine the roles of all the players and the stakeholders. And last but not the least, we also found that the banks are not favorable for the SMEs to take loans because they have complicated processes as well. And they ask for collateral guarantees, which SMEs and small enterprises do not have. So even the banking sector is not playing an active role. Our recommendations thus include mass awareness campaign among SMEs, strengthening of the inter-organizational coordination, and one window facilitations for SMEs. Thank you so much.
Lots of good ideas here, but this is not an evaluation itself, right? This is a contribution to a policy you expect. We expected in 2021, right? Your paper says. So where is it now?
It's still with the Prime Minister.
All right, so about to come out. And your main recommendations, one of them is mass awareness to introduce potential projects and international opportunities to SMEs. Another is to strengthen the role of the SME bank and support from other commercial and financial institutions. Third one is inter-organizational coordination, particularly between SMEDA and SME bank for policy making. Another one is to support SMEs to participate in global value chains and international production networks. And finally, one window facilitation for SMEs through SMEDA and SME Bank. All very sensible. And then the issues of registration, documentation come out, which these SMEs have in common with many other sectors, including housing, trucking, transport, health, education, trade, and finance. So very big sort of set of challenges there. If I were to make one contribution, it would be that things like awareness and financing and technical and vocational training, they would make sense. They would be useful if they were led from the demand side. And that is where this suggestion is important, linking them with global value chains and international production networks. I was evaluating a couple of trade projects between India and Pakistan back in 2014. And there were researchers in India who were saying that even those industries in Pakistan, such as the automobile spare parts manufacturers and others, who at that point were resisting trade liberalization between India and Pakistan, were persuaded not to resist when they were told that India-Pakistan trade, or for that matter, it could be with any other country, would help our industries get into global value chains. And that is not happening, and to the extent that it should. I mean, there may be a handful of industries that are plugged in nicely, but a lot more can be and are not there. And with that, you can also address productivity issues. And then TEFTA makes sense. How do you want to improve productivity? What skills, with what competencies? You can't sit in an office and pick up a textbook and start doing training. It has to be responsive to the market. And that is where, so I would say perhaps you may consider playing up the demand side where you talk about global value chains and, and then these linkages will have a demand, and in terms of both quantity and quality. Thank you.
Doctor. Thank you very much, Dr. Tarek. We'll take a few questions from the floor now. Actually, 5 in total, 4 from the hall and 1 online. Let's go.
Okay, we have, okay, Dr. Idris, you go first. Rafi, you can go next.
So,
okay, Dr.
This was the first exercise on evaluation, and I deserve a congratulations for this. Moving forward, I think that as the chair has also pointed out, that most of the studies, or some of the studies, went beyond their mandate and were actually doing situation analysis rather than evaluation because of the complexity of the task. So moving forward, perhaps we need a framework for evaluation. Perhaps the framework, of course, we can learn from international practices, but if we have to do exploratory studies of these kind, then probably we can start with what were the objectives of the organization for this setup, and whether or not those objectives were met, and or to what extent the objectives were met, and if the objectives were not met, what are the causes and whether those causes are within the purview of the organization or outside the domain of the organization. For example, if we go to the law is not conducive, then we are basically actually evaluating not the organization but the legislature. Because if we say that PIDE Act is not conducive to the function of PIDE, then it's the job of the legislature and it's not easy to amend the law. So perhaps these kind of framework, if we can do analysis, this would lead something. And finally, we can do perhaps some impact assessment as well as some quantitative stuff as well. So these are my sufficient for the
Thank you, Dr. Rafiq.
Okay, so actually, Dr. Rees kind of stole part of my question. So, but I just quickly wanted to ask for my own clarity. The question is that, for instance, like Dr. Rees said, is it, I was thinking pertinent to know how easy it is to do evaluations of entire agencies, or should it be the case that we should focus on specific projects or specific things that these agencies are doing and first identify the objectives and then look at the outputs and outputs that have been achieved. Even if we were to do evaluations of entire regulatory agencies and so forth, I feel, and this is my question to the expert we have here, shouldn't it be a better case that we first identify the objectives and then look at, because when I was in grad school back in the day, when I studied evaluation, we used to have these extensive results matrices, and then we would have this logical framework analysis and so forth. Has the methodology changed over time, or is it still the case that mostly in an international setting, when you're doing evaluations, you're first supposed to identify the results chains and then make matrices and come up with a logical framework? So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Karim.
Actually, I want to explain 2 points of the representative of NEPRA. He basically, they suggested that all the power are delegated to NEPRA except licensing and pricing. It implies that they are striving for power. There is a struggle of power between the government and the regulatory authority. In fact, pricing, as told by Dr. Nadeem, is not the job of government and neither the regulator. Actually, it is the function of the market. And similarly, if you see, there is a structural, this is a structural rigidity, which is, I guess, the main reason of circular debt in that sector. So, from this conference, actually, we have 2 messages. One for regulator to be a facilitator instead of being a Tanada. And the second one is for government, come out from the world of surcharges and subsidies and give a try to the market. And I guess these 2 are extremely essential for achieving efficiency, or you can say fairness in the market from the perspective of the consumer. Thank you.
Any other question from the hall? Okay, we have Dr. Gardar waiting online.
May I comment? I think about the NEP, I would add something. You talked about the competitive market. It's true that we should allow the market to determine the price, but the issue is taking into account that if we had better investment in the power sector, nobody was ready to invest in Pakistan. If there are so many distortions in the country, then definitely the regulator has to fix a price. And the fix basically, the price basically, they fix it as a mechanism. It is based on the investment defined mechanism for that. So that's basically the reason there are issues also. Theoretically, it's possible, but practically, it's not possible. About the evaluation, I would add another point, which is about, basically, basically said about the evaluation. I think if you go by indicators, for example, if you evaluate based on indicator, definitely the situation analysis will somehow basically you will we can take a data. But the problem is that if there is no data available, then you don't go by the indicator. So there is a case study approach or something like that. So you go by that. Anyway, there are different approaches. The thing is, the better is basically if you want basically the objectives, if you set the objective, evaluate the objective, definitely you go by that. But the problem is, we have better data in our ministries, in our departments, And that's the reason you go by basically the situation analysis thing like that, and you come up with something. But anyway, there are from both sides there are issues. I think with the time when the market matures, the data is available, things will improve.
Thank you. We have to take Dr. Kardar's question.
So please unmute yourself, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
I really saw a question, but just want to make 2-3 quick points. One, I think one of the things which hasn't come out, and I remember Nadeem making a reference to it, I've been joining and rejoining, I've had meetings. Why do we want to regulate? I mean, to me, the real issue is the objective. And secondly, as part of that is, because we want, so somehow we are control freaks. So that's the real issue. And if we agree that there is something to be regulated, is there a better instrument or a better institutional arrangement which can achieve the same objective? And I'll try and explain that in a moment. What has complicated matters is that now in a federal structure, we have a minimum of 5 regulators. And as far as we can see now, the other fact is that there is a lot of mistrust between the federation and the provinces. It doesn't help. Now, why do I mention all this? Take the case of the construction sector. We have buildings inspectors, we have electricity inspectors, because presumably, or should be, the objective is that a private building which is being used by the public needs to have some safety mechanism, like malls, cinema houses. But do we need a grade 11 building inspector? Or should we just be asking for the builder to actually get the building in short? So I mean, in a sense, ease of doing business, achieving an objective are really areas that I felt were missing. I mean, let me move on to my own experience. I was in the finance minister in the Punjab 21 years ago. Please bear with me, that's prehistoric times. I'd argued at that time that instead of discussing clauses of regulatory laws, we just rescind the laws and get those arguing in favor of the retention of the laws to come before us and make a case as to why this is required. I'll give you, and this brings me back to the building and the electricity inspectors and the grade 17 boiler inspector. And they're still there, by the way. The grade 17 boiler inspector tells Siemens how a boiler should be made. So really, and the beauty, and on the one hand, we lament the lack of consistency. Frankly, most of these things still exist. So I mean, there is a fair amount of consistency in terms of institutions and instruments which frankly have continued to be used. There has been no evolution or evaluation going forward. And that's been one of the tragedies, and it's becoming more and more complicated, despite the fact that a lot of now new instruments are available even within our own economy. Thank you. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, sir. I would like to apologize from everyone who has a question, and I think these questions are directed towards Dr. Tariq Hussain and Dr. Nadeem. So, sir, please. Ji, ma'am.
Your comments are well taken, Dr. Tariq Hussain, but I think it's a question of differences in perception. You look at the problem from the perspective of an evaluator. I'm a researcher, and I look at the perspective at the problem from a researcher's eye. So when you can conclude on slide number 3 or 4 that the package was not a success, then my mind would wander off and think, okay, why was it not a success? And look at the larger environment and the policies and the practices, both formal and informal rules, okay, why the package could not succeed. So I think it's a problem of perception. Secondly, unless we have a evaluation department in the at PIDE and people trained in formal evaluation, it's very hard to, come up to the mark of a, formal evaluation. Thank you.
Let me start with some comments that were, the first two comments that were made here about looking at the objectives. See, this is a discussion I had with all the researchers in May, June. And related to this is a question, can we evaluate agencies or only projects? You can do both. And my submission to the researchers at that point was, focus on effectiveness. Effectiveness is the extent to which a project or organization achieves its objectives or is likely to achieve its objectives. We are starting this process at PIDE. Just stick to effectiveness and do it well. Then I shared an example of an assessment I had done for the Asian Development Bank in 2010. Of all the ombudsman institutions existing in Pakistan at that time, there were 7 of them. So in that, by way of background, I brought in relevance also. Relevance to the country, to the target group, to existing policies, etc. Well, that's a relatively easy part. If you want, you can establish relevance, as some of these papers have tried to do, including the one on the construction package. But the real meat of it is in effectiveness. Any slogan can be relevant, and people will say that. That's the easy part. Effectiveness is about achieving objectives, and you can take their own indicators, you can make your own. There is a lot of literature. That's not a big issue. You can focus on a few and say, other ones I'll take up later. Okay? So I think this should be emphasized. Impact is also very difficult. And if you take another evaluation criterion, which is efficiency, that takes you into the nitty-gritty of an organization. And you can deal with it simplistically by saying it is too expensive or not, or you can go deep into it. But these things are so heavily determined by government and other rules and regulations, you're not likely to be able to deal with them. And if you want to, then you'll need additional expertise in HR, budgeting, procurement, all these behind the scenes activities, business processes and so on. And that's why I suggested, start with effectiveness. The extent to which the stated objectives have been achieved or are likely to be achieved. If you can do that very sharply, you would have made a tremendous contribution. You already have started. And, the kind of facts and figures that you're bringing out in these papers really deserve to come into the open with some very sharp conclusions and recommendations. Previously, there had been some papers on construction, on maybe housing, and on SMEs. But the 4 on the regulatory authorities are really, pioneering stuff. So they need to be taken to their logical conclusion. All this wealth of information you've collected, and you can collect more, I'm sure, and sharpen the analysis. So first of all, a huge amount of commendation and congratulations to PIDE and the researchers who have started this work. I mean, it deserves to continue and be strengthened. Focus on objectives if you can, and I think it'll streamline your work, it'll increase its usefulness. In general, please consult the international principles and practices I've shared with you a few months ago. This business of being independent and impartial is very important, and you have demonstrated with your papers that you can do it. You can be impartial and independent. At the same time, you want evaluations to be useful. and some of them to be owned. So you need to explain to those you're evaluating how they can use these evaluations. You may have a number of suggestions that the organization itself wants to see implemented. Explain this to them. Evaluations are useful for the people who are being evaluated as well as the general public and so on. And then you have to listen to them and get after them for more and more information. And for that, standard practice is request them to appoint a focal person formally, and that focal person should direct you to the persons concerned. These are bureaucracies, they have systems we can use. So just get into those systems and say, please give me this, this, and this, because I want to be sure about my facts. Like a good journalist, a good researcher also does that. So other principles are also useful. And, I've already shared them with you. Then coming to the distillation, we really need sharp conclusions. And conclusions are sometimes sitting there and sometimes kind of phrased, but not directly related to the evidence. So take a thorough look at the evidence you have put in, the facts. So the facts should support a conclusion. Just make the test. And finally, I would say, when we are giving recommendations, they should be aimed at a decision maker, a particular decision maker. Is a recommendation for the organization, for example, improve your HR, become more efficient, etc. Is it for the government? For example, don't interfere, don't set prices. Or is it for lawmakers? Please revise your laws, look at good international laws here and there. So your recommendations should be aimed for certain decision makers. Otherwise, they become very woolly and people say, I don't know whose job this is. But put people on the spot with your sharp recommendations. And, the sharper, the better, and they'll be more useful. So I think we have covered objectives. The findings you already have. We've talked about conclusions. We've talked about sharpening recommendations. And just one more thought is, for your own sake and for the audience, for the readers, if you can try and make your papers more manageable, you have covered a lot of ground. And maybe, I keep saying, maybe you're talking about 2 papers. If you're evaluating a project, your recommendation should be about that, rather, let's say government program, housing or Naya Pakistan or whatever it is. But if at that point you are saying the context or situation is very complicated, well, that deserves another paper, maybe another 10 papers. So there's no denying the facts. It's just a matter of how you want to package a final product for its user friendliness and usefulness. So with that, I would like to thank everyone, Dr. Nadimullah, the researchers, for sharing their content, their time with me, inviting me here, listening to this blah, blah about evaluation business. But certainly more power to you and best of luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tariq. All it remains for me to do is to thank you. You've been very kind. We promised to let you go at 2, and we will. I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes. I think the one thing that's very clear that we should be very aware of, we have been using the term research in a very misguided way in Pakistan. For us, research has been a copying Western literature, where we take a framework from outside, we run a regression, and we think we got research. 2, research has been repeating sort of kind of things that really don't, as Tariq says, are not very specific. Evaluation is a very important part of research. So what is research? Research is problem solving. When you go out and buy a dress or something, you're solving a problem. You have to do research. You don't buy a dress the first thing somebody shows you. When you go to buy a car, you do research. So we have to make our research problem-oriented. Right now, research is being kind of empty. So we have papers, tons of papers that say measure poverty. So measure poverty, what happens? Oh, poverty is 25, poverty is 35, poverty is 45. None of the poverty estimates compare. This is part of the problem that donors have created for us, measuring things that we don't know what they are. Then how does poverty end? Okay, in education. So we're giving tons of education, but poverty doesn't end and education doesn't happen. So we got a huge problem, we got circularity. So let's define our problem more specifically. And one very important problem is policies are being made. Policies are being made all the time. Agencies are being made all the time. Projects are being set up all the time. If researchers are not evaluating them, whose fault is it? It's our fault. So we should be evaluating policies, projects, agencies, everything that we can find. And that is should be our job. Now, when we evaluate anything, or even forget evaluate, let's go back. What is research about? Research is about decision-making, problem solving. How do we make decisions? That's part of research. What are we trying to do? We are trying to improve welfare in Pakistan. When we are trying to improve welfare in Pakistan, the literature tells us lots of things to do. Institution, okay, we set up institutions, we should read the laws, we should evaluate them. We set up markets, we should read the laws, we should evaluate them. We set up organizations, we should read laws, evaluate them. We set up universities, we have checked, there are no professors, we should evaluate them. So evaluation becomes a very important part of our research, and that's what we are trying to do. When evaluation, as Tariq says, means, or even policies, everything means objectives. We must understand what the objectives are. Often the law doesn't know the objectives. It is our job to clarify the objectives by critiquing the law. Often the institution doesn't know its objective. It's our job to clarify the objective. And then it's our job to be very hard and specific in our questions. That's when research becomes fun. Research becomes fun when you begin to understand what's happening around you, give it some structure, not just read a paper from JPE and copy it. We have to read, there's a wealth of information here. People tell me there's no data, there's data everywhere. There's a wealth of information here. It depends on us how we bring it out. And evaluation will become a very important part of your work. If you try and figure it out, it'll lead to very many important publications if you do it right. So thank you, Tariq, for showing us the way. And thank you, folks, for taking the lead and setting up this thing. We will, inshallah, try and improve on this. We will come back with more evaluations. Let's see how far we can take this subject, and let's see how we can inform a policy on how to make better institutions, better programs, better projects, better everything. Unless you evaluate something, you can't improve it. So we have to evaluate things. Let's make it a part of our research. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, folks. All the best. We finished at exactly 3:00.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Nadeem for his giving us a field to play. And thank you very much, Dr. Tariq Hussain, for your extended support throughout this and extremely wonderful insights on our evaluations. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Lunch will be served in the hall.